Good to see everybody. All right, finally, sorry, took me a second. Okay. So welcome to the inaugural online gathering of moral psychologists. My name is Thomas Nadelhofer. I'm a professor of philosophy at the College of Charleston. I'm also a member of the Moral Psychology Research Group, which is the sort of group that is putting this together. I've run some of these online talks before, so I volunteered to organize this first conference. So thanks to everybody for showing up. And some of you, thanks for having spread the word. That was very helpful. Looks like there's 60 people, which is a good turnout for a Friday afternoon. I was very excited about the program, and I was very humbled by the people that have agreed to give the talk. So I'm very excited to hear the talks the next couple of days. So the tentative schedule for today, first, John Doris from Cornell's Business School and Philosophy Department is going to give a sort of brief introduction to Moral Psychology Research Group. I'll give an introduction to the format that we'll be using both tonight and tomorrow. And then we've got a talk by Eric Schwitzgable from UC Riverside's Philosophy Department. All these times are going to be tentative. I'm sure we'll get behind, which is fine. Then Jillian Jordan, who's an assistant professor in the Negotiation, Organizations, and Markets Unit at Harvard Business School, is going to give her talk. She's the winner of the inaugural Gilbert Harmon Memorial Prize for Early Career Research in Moral Psychology. And John Doris will say a bit about the prize. And Laura Nemi will provide commentary. She's also at Cornell in the Business School and the Psychology Department. And John will do all the introducing for that part of tonight's program. And then the keynote address will be Manuel Vargas. He's at University of California, San Diego, in the Philosophy Department. And then at the end, the talks have the keynote addresses for both tonight and tomorrow will be an hour with a 30-minute Q&A. The rest of the main talks will be 30 minutes with a 15-minute. And I'll have to make sure I'm keeping up with the time. So I'll do that on my end. I'll say more about the schedule for tomorrow at the end of today. So for now, we'll just start with this piece. Okay, so let me quit sharing for a second because I forgot. John, are you, I forget who are you signed in as, John? Are you using Laura's?
Laura.
Okay.
I've commandeered Laura's tile.
Huh. I don't know, it's weird though. I don't know where. Sorry, give me a second. For some reason, you're not showing up.
I think
Huh.
I can see myself.
I see. Just under Laura Nemi. I don't know why. For some reason, it's not showing up. It's weird. I see you there.
Okay, well, that's your misfortune.
I do see you. How about this? I'm not so worried about pinning it.
Yeah.
You can talk, and we'll just do it that way. Hold on one second.
Yep, I know I can talk.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll just do it this way.
Yeah.
So John's going to say a little bit about the Moral Psychology Research Group.
I won't take up a bunch of time. This is kind of a special meeting. 20 years ago in April, Steve Stitch called a few people together in New Brunswick who had ideas about how moral psychology might be done better. And for the past 20 years, we've been informally, not to say chaotically, meeting to discuss one another's work. And to our delight, over those 20 years, an actual field has grown up around us with lots of bright and talented people doing moral psychology right. And so we thought we'd celebrate 20 years with a bigger tent kind of meeting, and get to meet some new folks. So thanks everybody for coming, and thanks to Thomas for putting this all together.
Thanks, no problem. If you want to know more about the group, I'll share the link to the webpage at the end of the session tonight. So if that happens to be something you want to know more about, you can find as much as you want to know about it there. Okay, so the format, as some of you have already discovered, the participants cannot unmute themselves. This isn't because I have a particular issue with giving you control or circumscribing your freedom. It's just that it makes it possible. It makes it more likely people are disruptive, and it makes it importantly possible for people to Zoom bomb sessions, which I don't want. So you can't do that. The second piece is please save your questions till the end of each talk. If you have a question, please use the raised hand icon and I will unmute you. If you're asking a question, all I ask is that you leave your hand raised until after the question has been answered, because the speaker won't see you. If you remove the hand raised, you'll no longer appear at the top of their screen and they'll be talking to, who knows, somebody else. So like, just leave it up until the question has been fully answered. If you have a question that we didn't have time for you to ask, and hence you didn't get an answer, if you just add it to the chat, I will make sure that the speaker receives the question after the fact. I'll email all the speakers the questions that they didn't have time to field. The recordings for each talk, or actually the recordings for each session, will be posted on the MPRG homepage for this event. I probably won't get them up until Sunday. But if you had students or colleagues who might be interested who didn't have the chance to watch these live, then I'll make the videos available. And then if you don't mind, please add your name. This is optional. Please add your name, affiliation, field, email address. Also, if you want to be part of a group email listserv that we're going to put together, so that we can, you're a grad student, you're a professor, you're postdoc. We want to get a sense for how many people showed up and where they're from. So if you want to put your name in the chat, that would be very helpful. Obviously not mandatory. Okay. So on to the first talk. Let me see if I can pin. Yeah, good. Oh. Okay, so our first speaker, as I said earlier, is Eric Schwitzgable. His talk is entitled The Measurement Problem. Eric is professor of philosophy at the University of California, Riverside. His most recent book is The Theory of Jerks and Other Philosophical Misadventures. He has written extensively on consciousness, self-knowledge, the nature of belief, and moral psychology. In moral psychology, he is probably best known for a series of papers that appear to show empirically that professional ethicists don't behave any more ethically than do comparison groups of professors not specializing in ethics. So please join me in welcoming Eric Schwitzgable. Eric, I'm going to pin you in just 1 second. Okay.
Great. Thanks for having me. And I'm going to stop your screen share and share my screen. And do people see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, good. So yeah, the moral measurement problem. This is based on work that I've been doing for a couple of years. Recently, Jesse Sun has joined me in collaboration on this. So thermometers are useful if you want to do a science of body temperature. I think we can all agree to that. A moralometer would presumably similarly be useful if you want to do a science of moral character. Right, so this would be some sort of measuring instrument that gives you a scalar readout of some sort about someone's overall morality, their overall general morality, from completely morally horrible on one end to completely awesome on the other end, right? So potentially, if we could design a moralometer, you could do science with it that could be very revealing. So for example, you could have moral interventions before and after some moral education program. Does this increase people's scores on the moralometer? You could look for correlations between general overall morality and other traits. For example, you could see if people who are overall more moral tend to have higher hedonic well-being, or any of a huge number of things, right? If you want to do a science on something, seems like you want to be able to measure it. And it seems like part of what we might want to do is do a science of morality, including general overall morality. So in a certain sense, I'll talk about some ethical problems with moralometers at the end, but in a certain sense, I could see how it might be appealing if we could construct a moralometer. However, the tenor of this talk is going to be pessimistic about the prospect. So I'm going to go through 3 or 4, depending on how you count, approaches to building a moralometer. So the first approach, the most obvious approach, is self-report. You could also do informant ratings. You could also do behavioral observation. You could also maybe do physiological ratings. So for self-report, you could ask someone a question like, overall, I would describe myself as, now we have a 7-point scale from extremely immoral to extremely moral, right? So you could just ask people that, see what they say. And in fact, the moral character questionnaire that Mike Furr and others have been working on for a few years seems to attempts to do this, right? So they have people agree or disagree with questions about, rate their agreement or disagreement on a 7-point scale with questions about their overall moral character, as well as their moral features in several other dimensions, like their honesty, their compassion, their purity. Now, self-report is obviously going to have some serious problems as an accurate measure of overall morality. One problem would be socially desirable responding. This is a well-known phenomenon that people tend to give answers to questions that they think will make them look good. You could also just have general dishonesty, right? So it probably doesn't look good if you tick the box that says, yes, I'm an extremely immoral person, right? The standard interpretation of how socially desirable responding works suggests that people will tend to avoid using the bad side of scales, normative scales like this, in evaluating themselves. Likewise, if you're asking about particular behaviors, say self-report of particular behaviors they might be trying to put together into a measure, you might ask people, whether they're dishonest, they've been dishonest with their spouse, or whether they've engaged in fraud, right? It's not clear that people will answer those questions honestly. The possible distortions here are not unidirectional, and they might interact in more than one way with underlying moral character. So for example, on a general question about overall morality, people who are, people might think it would come across badly just to tick the maximum scale in every single question. Like, yeah, I'm extremely moral. Say that over and over again. So there might be social desirability pressures in favor of presenting yourself as at least a little bit humble that would lead people to avoid also the top end of the scale. So we're not looking probably at social pressures that are uniformly in one direction, and they might interact with underlying moral character in certain ways, right? People who are more humble might tend to avoid the high end of the scale more than people who are less humble. So it's not going to be a simple thing, I think, to correct for socially desirable responding and dishonesty in a self-report measure of morality. And of course, there's the difficulty of moral self-knowledge. My own guess is that there's approximately a 0 correlation between people's moral self-opinion and their true moral character. It's a version, one way of thinking about this is to think about it as a version of the Dunning-Kruger issue, right? So think about someone who says, I'm not sexist in the least, right? Because they're ignorant about the nature of sexism, right? They might overestimate their egalitarianism due to ignorance, right? Whereas someone who is more knowledgeable about the details of how sexism works might rate themselves as having a little bit of sexism. So then you'd actually have an inversion between those two participants in their self-ratings relative to the real degree of underlying sexism they have, right? So the more morally ignorant someone is, either in general or about some particular aspect of morality, the more they might fail to appreciate that they are vicious in those particular respects. In some cases, we see, so part of developing this idea, we can refer to Simeon Vizier's well-known SOCA model of knowledge about character traits. This is the self-other knowledge asymmetry model. According to this model, self-knowledge of character is weak when traits are highly evaluative and not directly observable. So the more evaluative a trait is, the more people will tend to fail to see their tendency not to be good in that respect. And the less observable it is, the more people who are motivated to self-flattering conceptions can distort the evidence in their own mind to create a positive self-impression, right? So something like talkativeness, it's pretty observable. It's not very evaluative. It's kind of easy to know how talkative you are, right? But something like being unfair or being overall generally morally good, those things by this on the SOCA model would tend to be the kinds of things where we'd expect poor self-knowledge. And if we look at some studies, there tend to be near zero correlations between, for example, self-ratings and peer ratings of traits like unfair or having high general morality. And overall, I guess this is just developing problem 3 a little more. Overall, self-ratings of general morality tend to correlate poorly with informant ratings, right? So in a recent paper by Sun and Goodwin, in 2 samples, they had correlations of 0.15, R equals 0.15 and R equals 0.10 between self and informant ratings for morality. And you might even think those would be a little bit on the high side, to the extent that people might tend to choose, if they nominate their own informants, that people might tend to choose informants who would confirm their self-conceptions. So you could turn to informant ratings, right? This is something that Jesse in particular has been very interested in. You could ask people who know you best to rate your morality, your parents, your best friend, your spouse. Of course, informants are likely to be biased, and they probably won't be biased in a consistent way between subjects that allows for some constant discount, right? So some participant might nominate their spouse, another might nominate a friend. The spouse and the friend might have different levels of bias, right? Or even if you make sure that both participants nominate their spouses, right? One couple might be on the edge of divorce, while another couple is very happily married. They're going to be very different biases among even people who have superficially similar social relationships with each other. You could try to ask more neutral parties, such as teachers or peers at school or colleagues at work. But of course, they'll only have seen a very limited range of your behavior, a small portion of your behavior, usually only in one type of context. They'll also be biased. Friend bias tends to be especially high. Peers who regard themselves as friends will tend to rate people morally higher than they rate themselves. And there's probably also an issue about people using consistent scaling, right? So you might be in a social subgroup that tends to just give 5 stars to everybody. Everyone's great, right? Unless, there's something really bad going on. People in that subgroup might tend to max out the scale. In some other social subgroup, people might be inclined to just use the entire scale. So it's not clear that informant ratings, you're going to get consistent scalings, and you might get correlations in the errors for different types of people. All informants, of course, will be substantially ignorant and biased. And it doesn't seem like it's a trade-off sweet spot where you say, okay, well, this type of informant would maximize informedness and minimize bias in some nice compromise way. It seems like they're just going to be problems no matter who you choose. And of course, moral calibration is a problem, right? Not just scaling, but informants might be unreliable assessors of moral truths, right? So, just to go to the standard cartoon extreme example of this, right? If you're a Nazi and your other informants are also Nazis, then they might rate you morally great, even though you're terrible, right? So Eichmann thought very well, apparently, of the moral character of other Nazi leaders, right? And they might have rated him well too, right? But of course, that's completely off base morally. All right, so you could try behavioral observation. This is my own favorite approach, but it's got big problems too. The biggest one perhaps is the representativeness problem, right? It's always just going to be a small piece of behavior that you observe that's going to have dubious evidential value concerning someone's overall moral character, right? So I've done all these studies of the moral behavior of ethicists, like, did they respond to some particular email I sent them that was designed to look like it was from an undergraduate? Did they leave trash behind at their seat, during an APA session, stuff like that? That's just going to be one tiny piece of behavior, right? I feel like with enough stuff like that, you can start to draw some generalizations about groups, but to use this as a measure of some particular individual seems like you're just going to have a huge amount of noise. It's not going to be super indicative. There's also a problem with observability and measuring the behavior, right? People will tend to hide their moral behavior, especially they might hide the worst behavior that might be the most diagnostic, right? It's going to be difficult to behaviorally observe grievous sexual harassment or large-scale fraud. You're not going to get this, just by doing observational studies or asking people to self-report for that matter, right? More subtle behaviors are often difficult to track and to measure. Now, there are some behaviors that can be observed reliably, right? So we've done some studies recently about students choosing to buy meat or vegetarian food on campus after having been exposed to philosophical material on meat ethics. That's pretty interesting, I think, and cool. So, you've got one particular type of behavior you can systematically observe. We've also looked at stealing library books, looked at history of philosophers joining the Nazi Party, voter participation, responding to student emails, skipping out on paying conference fees, littering, stuff like that. You can observe this kind of stuff, and I have observed all this kind of stuff fairly systematically. And if you do so, maybe you can get samples that are large and representative enough for some group level judgments. But I think they will remain very dubious as for individual level judgments, even if you aggregate several of them together. There's also a selection problem here, right? If you wanted to try to aggregate some of these into a measure of an individual, you'll have to make a good selection of behaviors that are importantly morally revealing, and that seems like a pretty difficult theoretical task. The fourth way you could try to do it is by physiological measures, right? You could look at someone's genome, right? Are there genes for morality? You could do lie detector tests, right? Those are notoriously unreliable. You could try to do some brain physiology or fMRI studies. As far as I can tell, all of these are far too noisy for the foreseeable future and not really realistic. We've also got some problems of evaluating and weighing what we're interested in measuring. What traits or behaviors should be evaluated as moral or immoral, and how should they be weighted, right? So for example, if you're trying to construct a moralometer, do you include purity norms in that moralometer, right? On a certain view of morality, maybe sexual purity is really central to it. On another view, maybe not. Similarly with say loyalty or authority norms. How do you weigh different things against each other, right? So if someone is honest with their spouse in the morning and then dishonest with some of their co-workers in the afternoon, right? How would you weigh those things against each other? And I see two general types of approaches to the evaluation and weighting question. So we can use what I'll call flexible measures. These are measures that rely on raters' judgments and weightings rather than the experimenters, right? So the rater could be the self. The person could say, I am honest, or it could be an informant. Ava is a morally good person. Or you can use fixed measures. Fixed measures would rely on experimenters' judgments and weightings. So for example, a weighted average of various observed behaviors. They both have problems. So one set of problems revolves around relativism and particularism, right? So relativism is the idea that different behaviors are morally good or bad for people from different cultures. This isn't just the obvious point that people disagree about what's morally good and bad, but the more metaphysical point that different things could actually be good or bad, depending on what culture you're in. And particularism is the view that the goodness or badness of an action is contingent upon fine contextual details. I'm inclined to think that moderate versions of relativism and particularism are plausible, right? So for example, in different subgroups, there might be different norms of how generous you should be with your friends in sharing goods. There might be different sexual norms that really apply, right? That really vary between those groups and don't just, it's not just that opinions vary. It might be really inappropriate in one group to behave in a certain ungenerous or sexual way and perfectly fine in another group, right? So some moderate version of relativism is probably plausible. Same with particularism, right? So stopping to help someone who's stranded on the side of the road, right? Whether that's a good thing and how good a thing that is could depend on all kinds of fine details of the situation, right? Like your history, what seems to be going on the side of the road, how many other people are passing by, what social categories you belong to, what social categories the person who needs help belongs to, all kinds of details might get weighed. So there wouldn't be like one kind of moral amount that you would attach to stopping to help a stranger by the side of the road. So if those are true, if it's true, then flexible measures might be preferable to fixed measures, right? Because the extent you use flexible measures that are applied by knowledgeable raters within the subcultures and knowledgeable raters who know maybe more of the particulars of the situation, the more you can kind of handle this variation due to relativism and particularism. Of course, there's risk there too, because the raters might not know all the particulars and they might not really belong to the target subculture in the right way. But it seems like fixed measures are inevitably going to be kind of ham-handed in dealing with issues of relativism and particularism. Of course, flexible standards lack transparency, right? You don't know why this person is being rated as honest or good. It could be for all kinds of terrible reasons, like, they're good because they joined the Nazi party. And they aggravate the problems of bias, rater moral error, and scaling differences. Another problem is just plain old incommensurability, right? So incommensurability is the idea that there might be no fact of the matter exactly how various moral goods and bads ought to be weighed against each other, right? So $20 bills and $10 bills are commensurable, right? Two $10 bills is exactly equal to one $20 bill, right? But lying to your spouse in the morning and then being generous to a coworker in the afternoon, right? Is there exact, how do those trade off against each other? Is there even a fact of the matter about how exactly they should be weighed against each other? Again, I'm inclined to think that moderate incommensurability has some plausibility, right? There are some things that are obviously morally worse than others, right? Gross sexual harassment of an employee is obviously morally worse than telling a minor fib to your spouse to get out of washing the dishes, right? So it's not like things are completely uncomparable, but to think that there's always a precise comparison that's the correct weighting of two good or bad actions or other things that we can evaluate. That seems, to me, at least a little optimistic, but we, of course, argue about that. To the extent incommensurability has some truth to it, that puts an in-principle limit on the accuracy of any moralometer that outputs a scalar value. It's just always going to be kind of a crude thing. Also, fixed measures require theorists to choose and apply a moral theory, which is inevitably going to be contentious. So, for example, there's just the famous dispute between consequentialist and deontological and virtue ethical principles. For example, I'm wearing my trolley problem t-shirt today. So, that's a famous case where standard issue deontology and standard issue consequentialism tend to come apart. There will be differences in theorists' views about specific applications of those principles. For example, Kant famously thought you should never lie under any circumstances, even to a murderer at the door who's chasing down your best friend, right? Whereas other deontologists don't have so strict a view. Philosophical moral theories are unlikely to be sensitive to particular considerations, right? Part of the point of ethical particularism is to undercut the idea that we can adhere to general moral principles that apply consistently across cases. You've also got issues like how much do you weigh good intentions versus good outcomes? How much do you consider moral luck. Is there such a thing as moral luck? Can something be really different in its moral value depending on the luck of the outcome? You can also wonder whether we should apply unintuitive principles like the Singer principle, right? So if we apply the Singer principle that you should be willing to sacrifice a luxury in order to help someone far away, that's one application of it, right? Then you end up with unintuitive conclusions like it's immoral to spend $20,000 on your children's tuition because that money could be spent to save some people's lives far away. Right? That's obviously contentious. If we put that into our moralometer, we're going to end up with a very contentious moralometer, right? Or even more extreme one is the repugnant conclusion. I don't know how many of you have heard of this one, but this is this idea that most of the suffering in the world might be in wild animals, including insects. So if we accept the repugnant conclusion, the strongest moral demand upon us right now is to minimize insect suffering. All right, so it seems likely to me that researchers will go somewhat wrong in choosing moral theories. They'll certainly diverge from each other, and maybe they'll go badly wrong. And these are going to have to be built into any fixed moralometer. Few other issues, right? Situationism. If moral behavior is highly variable between situations, then even a moralometer that perfectly rank ordered people's overall morality might not effectively predict particular instances of future behavior. It also implies, to the extent situationism is true, or something in that direction is true, it also implies that few shot measures are likely to have little diagnostic value. We also have problems, I think, with moral licensing, or as I like to think of it, moral mediocrity, right? So if people morally improve in one area, that might go along with moral worsening in another area, right? So if you put in, just as a cartoon example, if you put in the effort to become a vegetarian, you might feel licensed to behave worse in some other ways, right? If we're only measuring one of those, then there might be no change in overall morality, but our measure might be messed up by that. So these problems are all so severe that I think we cannot build a moralometer that would accurately measure people's overall moral character. Even correlation of R equals 0.3 seems to me too optimistic. It's going to be harder than standard issue personality traits to a substantial extent. Now, you might think it's worth having some information. What if we had a moralometer that correlated, say, at R equals 0.15 with real underlying moral character? Well, here are some problems with that. I think that would not be enough for moral knowledge about individuals, right? If you know someone's reading on the moralometer that correlates only 0.15, you do not know that person's moral character, right? So we have to be careful about that. Another thing is, if it's designed as some sort of scientific measure, then people might take it much more seriously than it deserves to be taken if it's got a correlation that low. It kind of becomes legible to people and seemingly scientific, which means it might get used in abusive ways that give it more weight than it deserves. Imagine using it, say, as an employer trying to hire employees. You say, oh, well, we'll use the moral test to see if our employees are any morally good, right? That might be problematic even if you had a perfect moralometer. But if you've got one that's highly, highly imperfect, that's approaches dystopian. And of course, it would systematically disadvantage people who score low if it's used for any practical purpose. Likewise, if it's used for any practical purposes, it would invite gamification and teaching to the test, right? In fact, the better a moralometer you construct, the more people might be tempted to use it in applications. The more people are tempted to use it in applications, the more likely people will be to find ways to beat it. So in a way, the better your moralometer becomes, the worse it's likely to become in the future as people learn how to gamify their way around it. So bad news, in my view, for moralometers. However, I did mention this to my daughter. I've been talking about this for a couple of years. When she was 13, she refuted me in the following way. She constructed me a moralometer and gave it to me for my birthday. So there you go. All right, that's it. Thank you.
self. Let me get a new timer set going. All right, so I will field the, I mean, I'll help him. You put up your hand if you got questions. And I'll make sure I keep up with that, and Eric can just focus on answering them. Walter, you're up.
So Eric, I'm like totally inclined to agree with you about the inability to formulate a moralometer that goes across the scale in any fine-grained way. But I wonder whether you're equally skeptical about picking out the worst of the worst, the psychopaths, and at least you can identify whether somebody's at the end of the scale, even if in the middle there's a lot of insecurity and lack of correlation.
Yeah, I am not sure about that. It could be that people who are really, really terrible would show up in moralometers in some way, but I'm not sure why we should think that, absent some highly diagnostic action that we're not likely to capture scientifically except by accident, right? So if we think about, say, pre-hoc trying to figure out, who's going to be terrible, who's really going to be terrible based on their self-report or some measurement we do of their behavior using experience sampling or something. I don't know. Like psychopaths are pretty good at fooling people into thinking that they're nice sometimes. Right. If we look after the fact that, like, say, somebody who's murdered their spouse and child, right, then yeah, I think we could be probably pretty safe. That's diagnostic of a pretty terrible moral character. But
I was just thinking at the bottom, there might be more agreement about certain types of actions being widely agreed on as being problematic, even though there's going to be a lot of disagreement about other actions, and people that are way far at the bottom might display the kinds of behaviors that everybody's going to agree should be criticized. So you get rid of some of the disagreement problems by focusing on the clear cases.
you might be able to, same at the top, you might be able to say, hey, look, here are some people who really given their lives over to some amazing cause, right?
Right.
You might be able to do that.
Okay, Jonah. Oh, sorry. I got to unmute you. Yeah. Sorry, man. Oh, sorry about that. Now I think you can do it. Yeah. Perfect.
Eric, thank you. Really appreciated your talk. You mentioned differences in moral theory producing different assessments of certain actions, but I'm also wondering whether differences in moral theory make a difference at the front end, just in terms of how I'm even thinking about building my moralometer. I think the most obvious kind of difference would be between the virtue theorist classically construed and the utilitarian classically construed. If I'm a virtue theorist, I'm going to look for some empirical data that is correlative or directly causally connected to flourishing, i.e. I've bug tapped, or e.g. I've bug tapped their therapy sessions and I know, wow, that person is just doing so well, they must have to be moral. And if I'm a utilitarian, I might find some utility index of their life from the point of view of nowhere. And so I'm wondering, is it even possible to build a theory neutral moralometer, or is that going to kind of have front end influence as well as fine grained difference at the level of different cases?
Yes, I agree. I think it's going to have front end influence, and then it's going to be impossible to build a theory neutral run for exactly the reasons you articulated.
Okay, Eddie, you should be able to unmute yourself, friend.
He looks unmuted, but I can't hear him.
Yeah, I can't hear you either.
Still can't hear you. I don't know what's going on.
Hmm? Yep, that's what it seemed like. Well, so Eric, I'll ask a question while Eddie's trying to sort out the thing. So what would be so you don't think there's like a lot of prospects for making a moralometer, right? But what would be the closest you think you can get, right? I mean, is it that you can't even get it off the ground? So there's, or is it just something, it's either it's good enough or else it'll just be abused. And then, so there's just, you could think it's hopeless in that way. Yeah.
Right. I'm inclined to think that it's pretty close to hopeless. I mean, I'm debating between predicting R0 and R.15, you know, if you're thinking in terms of 0.15, you know, then maybe you could do a little bit of science with it. But yeah, I think that if we're going to try to measure morality, it's going to have to be through measuring general morality in a scientifically rigorous way is going to be unlikely and maybe not worth attempting.
Yeah.
I mean, we can measure somewhat better. A lot of the same problems arise for measuring particular dimensions of morality, like honesty or purity, right? I think you get a lot of similar problems, but they're maybe not quite as stark. And you can get self-reports and opinions about overall morality. So you could take a questionnaire like the moral characteristics questionnaire and not treat it as a measure of someone's overall morality, but maybe as a measure of their self-opinion about their morality. And that might correlate with some interesting things.
We ran into similar problems trying to figure out how to measure humility, right?
Right.
That was like the barrier to that is obvious. It is precisely the sort of thing that people who are humble will underestimate their humility, and people who are not humble will overestimate. I mean, this was one where it was sort of clear. So you have to figure out maybe more creative ways. I mean, maybe that's an area where it might be helpful to think about, just because that problem was at the sort of a focus of all the people trying to develop all these different measures.
Right. Humility is going to be a hard one. Also, I think fairness is going to be a hard one. Yeah. I think with fairness, you really get the Dunning-Kruger problem really severely, because I think that unfair people rarely recognize the respects in which they're being unfair. If you look at a trait like compassion, you know, that might be a little more tractable.
Right. Right. So what else? Eddie, did you figure this out? Now his camera's not working either. Eddie's having a technological breakdown.
Not many questions. I guess I convinced everybody.
Fabrizio.
Eddie could type his question in the chat, is what Al suggested.
Oh yeah. So let me, there you go, Fabrizio. Sorry, you're unmuted. You can unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Hi, Professor. Nice to talk with you. I think also between your moralometer and also this moral landscape of some Paris, do you think that new advances in the psychology of well-being can bring us closer to that moralometer? And for example, I think in maybe broader dimensions, like for example, personality traits. We have the dark trait of personality, the light trait of personality, leadership styles, parenting styles, and different dimensions that can suggest us which kind of behaviors allows or enhance well-being in people. Not to mention other variables that could add, like gratitude, compassion, wisdom, altruism. So, because I'm also concerned how to develop this kind of moralometer, and maybe if we change our dimensions. So I don't know what you think about. And my last question is, any more thoughts about this field of moral enhancement?
Sorry, what was it, the field of moral
enhancement?
Enhancement.
Yeah, and more thoughts about that.
Right. So on that last thing, you know, I have the usual skeptical thoughts about derived from eugenics about moral enhancement. Although, on the face of it, it sounds good in a certain way, right? It has a lot of dystopian potential, especially if the enhancers have a faulty conception of what morality is, or if they reduce important diversity among people. On well-being, I'm inclined to think that well-being measures have a lot of the same problems that a moralometer would have, although maybe not quite as extreme, especially if you conceptualize well-being in particular ways. But there's a lot of debate about what exactly constitutes well-being and how it relates to morality. You might think that the relationship between well-being and morality is not as tight as it's cracked up to be. So I have some of the same concerns with the well-being literature. Yeah. Oh, yeah, you seem to be muted. I think Fabrizio wants to follow up. Do you mind unmuting him?
You're good.
Okay, yes, sorry to before. I think that, of course, we can find some problems about measuring and defining well-being, but as in this book of the Moral Landscape of Tom Harris, we also have some problems maybe with health and other concepts that doesn't avoid to help us to how to improve wealth or health in people. So I think that if we approach to morality in a way that how we can improve well-being in myself and the other one, we can come up with different ideas of how to helping societies to develop. Like, for example, from parenting styles, if we pursue some special kind of parenting, we can enhance in childhood how to express emotions, how to be more empathetic, how to behave in a more altruistic way. So my suggestion is that maybe if we try to look morality as a way to how to, which kind of behaviors help to improve well-being in oneself and other ones, maybe that could be a different path to try to overcome these concerns or problems about the moralometer, which I found a very interesting research question.
Right. Yeah. So although I have methodological concerns about well-being measures, I don't think it's completely hopeless. And I do think that enhancing people's well-being is a good thing. And I think it might be the case that people who experience themselves as having high well-being feel less need to engage in some of the more egregiously negative moral actions. So although I'm kind of in the methodological pessimist direction generally, I feel the pull of what you're saying. I think there is some merit in that. I would agree with that.
Let's see if this works for you, Eddie. Oh yeah, because you logged out. Yep.
Now, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Just had to change computers. So thank you, Eric, for an interesting talk. And thanks again to Thomas for putting all this together. So my questions are like Walter's about the cases at the extremes. I thought Walter was going to bring up some of the scales for psychopathy or Machiavellianism or something that on most moral theories we might agree are pretty reliable indicators of being near the bottom of at least a lot of immoral types of traits, and might have R's that are a lot higher than 0.1 or 0.3 or maybe even higher than that. So maybe there's something at the bottom of the scale. And then at the top of the scale, I don't think there's going to be anything like a moral meter or whatever you're calling it. But I really, I can't shake the intuition that humans, at least some humans, are pretty damn good at telling who's a decent person and who's not. And you know, we're all pretty good at knowing who our good colleagues are and who our bad colleagues are. And so that third personal version that you had, where if you ask enough people who know them, colleagues, friends, family members, I think you might get some pretty high reliability at the top end of the scale, maybe the bottom end too. that this guy's a mensch. Everybody knows that Eric is a mensch. I mean, we don't need to.
Oh, well, if that's what you think, then of course I agree.
Right. But right. I mean, is that
Well,
intuition?
this is Jesse's son is working exactly on this, and that's partly why I brought her on, because I think that the peer ratings are really interesting, have really interesting potential. So one of the things that she's done and work that's currently under submission is have people nominate other people they know as exceptionally moral or exceptionally immoral, or kind of in the middle, and then have other peers rate those people and then look for correlations among those ratings. And she's finding some correlations, but they're not great. What, I can't pull up the R values right now, but 0.3 maybe. So, and then you wonder, okay, is that 0.3? Is there really a lot of signal in that 0.3, or to what extent is that correlated noise? But yeah, there might be something in that. Another thing I'd be really interested in seeing, and I'm ignorant on this, but if you look at, say, the dark triad personality traits, how well do responses on that correlate with real world immoral behavior? I mean, that's hard to measure, except if you're looking at, say, prison populations or something like that. And then I don't know how much you want to generalize that to other cases. So even if you get nice relationships with others, say, self-report measures, what underneath that is really going on is not clear. Or even laboratory measures, right? Someone who self-rates themselves as being Machiavellian and then keeps all the money in a dictator game, yeah, that reveals something about them, but how well that would generalize to how they actually treat their friends, I think, would be definitely an open question.
Okay. Oh, Walter, you're up. You have the final question, sir.
I just have a quick follow-up to Eddie's question. You talked about using other people's ratings, but that's not really a measure of whether the person is moral. It's a question whether they're seen as moral.
Exactly.
Right? And so I wasn't clear whether you were arguing against both of those, because I can imagine, a measure of perceived morality, but that wouldn't be a measure of real morality.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree. So it's peer informant reports are measures of, at best, perceived morality, which then might relate with real morality, but it's not always clear that they are good measures of perceived morality, because one thing that happens that you see in these is that they tend to be near ceiling, because people who are reporting on the moral character of their friends, they don't want to tell on their friends, they don't want to be perceived as insulting their friends, right? So even in Sun's work, where people are nominating the people who they think are morally worst, you still get ratings mostly above mid-scale of their overall moral character. So yeah, so I would definitely not take informant reports at face value.
Okay, well, Eric, thank you very much for your willingness to give the first talk of the first online gathering of moral psychologists. We very much appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. So I'm going to unpin you. We'll take a couple minutes just so that if you need to, grab something to drink or go to the bathroom, that'll be fine. Maybe we'll meet back in, say, 5 minutes, and John Doris will introduce the Harmon Prize and the Jillian Jordan and Laura Nemi. Okay. So John, are you still floating around somewhere?
Yes, I
Okay.
continue to control Laura's tile.
Good. Good. That's good. I just want to make sure I knew where you
I'm
were.
not a search birdie.
Yeah. Right.
So I think, Thomas, the way we'll do this
Mhm.
is to save time and in the interest of seamlessness. I will introduce Jillian, and she can hand off directly to Laura.
Okay. When it's time for that to happen, I will make sure I pass the pin baton. Everybody is already, both of them are already able to share their screens. So
Okay.
whenever that's ready, they can do it. And I will pin them appropriately during the Q&A so that it's easier for the audience to see the record, especially for the recording. Hi, Jillian.
Hi, Jillian.
Huh.
Hi. Okay, great. Now I can unmute. Thanks.
Yeah, I don't know why you weren't able. Let me make sure that you can do that.
Yep.
I tried to set it up so that
Her
all.
fans want to see her, Thomas.
There we go. What's that?
Her fans want to see her, make sure everything works.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. And you guys can hear me now, right?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Do you want to, just as a test run, make sure you're able to share your screen?
Perfect. I will do that.
Yep.
And you guys just see the slides only, right?
Correct.
Great.
Perfect. All right.
Awesome.
I saw Victor. How you doing, Victor? Okay. Right there. How you doing, Dave? From a distance, our video feeds look a lot alike, Dave. If I wore collared shirts, we would be like, you know. John, I'll leave the, I'll start this, I'll share my screen so that the slides are up while you introduce everything.
Okay.
And then you'll be foregrounded at the top. I shouldn't need to pin you for anything. You should, as soon as you start talking, I'm muted. You should be the person.
Okay, I'm unmuted now, so
Yeah, perfect.
I can
Actually, let me go ahead. I will go ahead and pin you just to make sure it's working. Yeah, there we go. All right, that's probably time. We should probably make sure we get through this. We should go ahead and get started.
Yeah.
Let me share the screen. Okay. All right, everybody. Welcome back. This is the next phase. John's going to say a little bit about the Harmon Prize, which I'm very excited that we're doing. And then he'll introduce Jillian and Laura.
Once again, I'll be brief since I know you're here to see Jillian and Laura, but I won't spend a lot of time. Everybody knows about Gil Harmon, 54 years at Princeton and all of that time a central figure in philosophy. It's less well known, all the encouragement he gave to fledgling moral psychologists at a time when not many mainstream philosophers at big departments would give us the time of day. So he's materially implicated in us being here now. And we miss him a lot, but it does our hearts good to know how delighted he'd be that Jillian is getting this award in his honor. And so just to tell you a little bit about Jillian, she's a assistant professor in Harvard Business School. She also graduated magna cum laude from Harvard, trained at Yale, postdoc. Summa, I always get that Latin mixed up. Sorry to downgrade that. So and then off to Yale for her PhD, postdoc at Northwestern and back to Harvard. Although she's only a 2018 PhD, she's already piling up, as we say in business schools, A publications, not only in the best psychology journals, but in the kinds of general science journals like PNAS and Nature that most of us are lucky to get one publication in our career. So we're delighted that the future of moral psychology is in good hands, and we're sure Gil would have been too.
You want to go ahead and introduce Laura? Do you want to do that after Jillian's done?
Yes. Yeah. So Laura is also another young moral psychologist who works in management, where the numbers of moral psychology are swelling. She also has a Harvard connection as a postdoc at Harvard. She's a Leanne Young student from Boston College, and she's published widely on issues that connect very well to Jillian's topics today, since she's done lots of work on victim blaming as well as other topics in moral psychology. And she's currently right here in the psychology building at Cornell, where she is when she's not teaching in the business school. All right.
Okay, perfect. Well, I'll quit sharing my screen. I'm going to unpin you. And I'm going to, this takes a second. It's like, let me pin, one last thing, Jillian, hold on one second. Let me,
Oh, sorry.
no, you're good. So now you're pinned. Perfect.
Great. And everyone can see the slides.
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you guys so much. I'm so honored to have won this award, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share this work with you all. So thank you for being here. And I also wanted to just give a heads up that I'll be talking about sexual violence in this talk, and also sharing some vignettes that we showed that have descriptions of sexual assault. So the work that I'm going to present today is in collaboration with Rosanna Summers at the University of Michigan Law School. And our work is sort of focused on the fact that sexual assault is a pervasive problem, and that victims of sexual assault often don't get the support that they need. And we're interested in this work in sort of what determines how we perceive victims of sexual assault and whether or not we support them. And previous research highlights a variety of factors that are relevant to this question. So some of these factors relate to the perceiver, the person judging the victim. Their ideology and moral values may be relevant to whether they blame versus support the victim. We also know features of the victim might matter, like what was she wearing? Was she drinking? Is she seen as a promiscuous person by other people? And it also matters features of the assault in the context. So for example, was the assault perpetrated by an acquaintance of the victim versus a stranger? This has been shown to be an important factor. And in this work, we're interested in another sort of related contextual factor that might matter for how we perceive victims, which is whether or not the sexual assault followed from a sexual encounter that was initially consensual. And this is actually quite common. So for example, a recent survey of over 180,000 students across 33 American universities found that about a third of sexual assault victims reported that the perpetrator was somebody they were involved with or intimate with at the time. So it's common for sexual assault to follow from initially consensual interactions. The survey also revealed that when people said that they didn't report their sexual assaults, it was common to cite the fact that the event happened in a context that began consensually as a reason for not reporting. So upwards of half of victims who said that they didn't report their sexual assault said that this was a factor in why they didn't report, suggesting that people may hold the belief that they will receive less support when they are sexually assaulted if the assault followed from an initially consensual encounter. And so in this talk, we're interested in what we've termed adjacent consent, which is when an individual consents to something in the sexual domain, like kissing or foreplay, but what occurs, like sexual penetration, exceeds what they consented to. So a sexual assault follows from something adjacent that was consensual. And we're interested in whether adjacent consent might be an important factor that shapes perceptions of sexual assault victims. And so we show that victims of sexual assault who have provided adjacent consent are indeed seen differently. And in particular, they're seen as less morally virtuous, they're blamed more, and they're judged to be less worthy of support. And then we also kind of get at two distinct reasons why this is the case, and in particular, why adjacent consent can diminish the perceived moral character of sexual assault victims. So the first is sort of the familiar idea that even in the absence of sexual assault, some people might disapprove of the consensual sexual activity that occurred. Right, so this is the idea of slut shaming or people disapproving of hookup culture. We might imagine that if someone provides adjacent consent, even when there's no sexual assault on the table, people might react sort of negatively to what they did consent to, the consensual sexual activity. Or they might react negatively to the fact that there was consent to something, but then not consent to other things, right? So we're familiar with the idea of maybe negative attitudes towards women who engage in teasing behavior. They say yes to one thing, they say no to another thing. This could be judged negatively, even in the absence of assault. The second mechanism through which we find that adjacent consent undermines the perceived moral character of assault victims is sort of the key novel theoretical contribution of this work that I think is a less familiar idea. And the idea is that we find that adjacent consent prevents people from morally elevating victims if they are assaulted, if a sexual assault does occur. So what do I mean by morally elevating victims? Well, this work draws on a previous finding of mine that I've termed the virtuous victim effect, where we find that people tend to perceive victims of wrongdoing as more morally virtuous than non-victims who have behaved in exactly the same way but haven't been mistreated by other people. And we find that people morally elevate victims in this way across a variety of types of moral transgressions that could happen to them and make them victims, including sexual assault. So for example, in one of these studies, we had people learn about someone who owned an iPad, they lent it out to somebody else. Either that was sort of the end of the story and they weren't a victim, or the person they lent the iPad to actually stole their iPad and they became a victim. And people see this person who owned the iPad as more morally virtuous when someone stole it and they became a victim. And we found this pattern across a variety of transgressions, including rape. So we find evidence that people sort of morally elevate victims as maybe a natural feature of our moral psychology. And so you might ask, why is this happening? Why do we morally elevate victims in this way? And our proposed explanation is that people often face incentives to help victims of wrongdoing and also to punish the perpetrators who have wronged them. So for example, we might face normative pressure to do these things. There might be social norms encouraging us to support victims and to punish perpetrators. And seeing victims as virtuous has this motivational function. It motivates us to take these sort of justice restorative actions to help victims and to punish perpetrators. So the graph that I just put up is showing results from a study where we manipulate whether or not someone who's always a victim, so here we're not manipulating victim status, but we manipulate whether somebody who's always a victim is described initially as a really moral person in the lighter blue color, or as a less moral person in the darker blue color. And it turns out when somebody that was described as really moral gets victimized, participants say that they're more willing to help them and more inclined to punish the perpetrator who wronged them, right? So seeing victims as virtuous has this motivating function of encouraging us to engage in these justice restorative actions of helping victims and punishing perpetrators. So this provides sort of a functional framework for why we might imagine that people would see victims as virtuous. I think this also aligns with the sort of philosophical theory from Gene Hampton of why we punish, the expressivist theory of punishment. So what Hampton proposes is that when a perpetrator wrongs a victim, it sends this message of moral superiority that demeans the victim, right? It suggests that the perpetrator is better than the victim. And that this is a false message and that it demands a community response that affirms that the victim actually has equal moral status, that they're not inferior to the perpetrator, that this was an unjustified transgression. And Hampton proposes that punishment sort of serves this function of affirming the victim's moral status. We might think of this moral elevation of victims, this virtuous victim effect, as another component of sort of an affirming community response when somebody is victimized. So returning to adjacent consent and why adjacent consent sort of diminishes the perceived moral character of sexual assault victims, the sort of key theoretical contribution we're going to make is we're going to argue that adjacent consent actually prevents people from showing this virtuous victim effect in the case of sexual assault. It prevents people from morally elevating victims if a sexual assault occurs. So to support these two claims, I'm going to present data from survey experiments in which we gave people vignettes about sexual assault that were adapted from the work of Nemi and Young. And I'm going to talk about data from a total of 9 pre-registered studies where we mostly recruited Americans from Amazon Turk. And we also recruited some subjects from the University of Michigan and from Prolific. And our studies built around a basic 2x2 design in which we manipulated, in a vignette about a female protagonist, 2 factors. We manipulated whether she provided adjacent consent, so whether she consented to nothing sexual at all in our complete non-consent conditions, or whether she consented to something adjacent to sex in our adjacent consent conditions. And then we also manipulate whether or not she was ultimately sexually assaulted, and therefore whether or not she was a victim. So what did this look like? So in our complete non-consent conditions, the target doesn't consent to anything sexual at all. So participants learn about a woman named Alicia, who is a college student who goes with friends to a campus fraternity party. And at the party, she chats with a few different acquaintances, and one of them is named Michael, and he lives in the frat. And during their conversation, she doesn't flirt with Michael, and he has no idea whether or not she's attracted to him. And then at some point, Alicia and Michael are talking about movies, and Michael offers to show Alicia a movie poster in his bedroom, which was just upstairs, and she agrees. In the non-victim version of this vignette, when they get to his room, Michael shows Alicia the poster, so she's not a victim in any way. In the victim version of this vignette, however, when they get to his room, he closes the door and pushes himself on top of Alicia. She tries to push Michael off of him, but she's not strong enough. She tries to scream, but he covers her mouth, and then he forces sexual intercourse with her. So she's forcibly sexually assaulted, and she hasn't consented to anything in the sexual domain whatsoever. In our adjacent consent conditions, we start with the same basic background information about Alicia attending this party and talking to her acquaintance, Michael. However, during their conversation, Alicia flirts with Michael, and he gets the sense that she's sexually attracted to him. Then at some point, they're talking about movies, and he suggests they go upstairs to his bedroom, and she agrees. There's no mention of showing her a poster as a reason for going upstairs. And when they get to his bedroom, they close the door and begin hooking up. So she consents to something in the sexual domain with Michael. In the non-victim version, after a while, Alicia tells Michael that she wants to stop, and he stops, so she doesn't become a victim. Whereas in the victim condition, when she says she wants to stop, he doesn't listen. Instead, he keeps going. And at this point, she tries to push him off of her, but she's not strong enough. She tries to scream, so he covers her mouth and forces sexual intercourse with her, just like in the victim ending of the complete non-consent condition. So in this case, Michael still forcibly sexually assaults Alicia. It's very, very clear to him that she's not consenting by the end of the story. But she has previously participated voluntarily in a sexual encounter with Michael that flows into this sexual assault. So what I'm going to show you in a moment is I'm going to show you the perceived moral character of Alicia. People rate how moral they think she is and how trustworthy they think she is, and we average those together, and that's on the y-axis, as a function of whether or not she's assaulted and also whether or not there was adjacent consent. And I'm going to show data across 5 different studies that use this basic design in this vignette, testing adults on Amazon Turk. The studies show really consistent results, so that's why I'm aggregating them together. So these are the patterns that we find. And the first thing I want to draw your attention to is the comparison of the 2 bars where she is a victim. So where Alicia does get sexually assaulted. And what we see is that a victim of forcible rape seems less morally virtuous to participants if she had consented to something adjacent to sex prior to being raped. So participants see Alicia as less virtuous in the adjacent consent condition compared to the complete non-consent condition. We also find that victims who provided adjacent consent are blamed more and seen as less deserving of support. So what I'm showing here is mean differences across a variety of measures in these 2 victim conditions when there is or is not adjacent consent. And all of these differences are statistically significant. So we find that Alicia is blamed more. We find that people report feeling less sympathy, less sorry for her. And they also agree less with sort of statements endorsing helping of Alicia and punishing of Michael. So they agree less that the university should provide Alicia with academic accommodations to help her cope with what happened, and that her peers should go out of their way to sort of support her even when doing so is costly or difficult. They also agree less that Michael should be expelled from the university and banned from its campus, and that going to prison would be an appropriate consequence for Michael's behavior. We also measured, just to sort of get a sense of how people were perceiving these situations psychologically in absolute terms, we measured agreement with explicit statements about whether a rape occurred, whether there was consent or perceived consent. So if you look at the first two statements here, we see that people agreed in absolute terms very much that a rape occurred, that she was a victim of rape, that he was a rapist, although they agreed less with these statements when there was adjacent consent. We also see in absolute terms that people did not think there was consent or that Michael perceived consent to a great degree, but that they agree more with these statements about consent when there was adjacent consent. So returning to our finding that a victim of forcible rape seems less morally virtuous when she consented to something adjacent to sex, we wanted to know sort of why is this going on? And so now I want to walk through the two different reasons that I mentioned before that are contributing to this effect. So if we look just to the non-victim conditions, we can see that adjacent consent is actually perceived negatively as a negative sign of moral character, even when no sexual assault occurs, right? Even when Alicia does not become a victim. And so this highlights that adjacent consent is carrying like a baseline moral penalty. Even in the absence of sexual assault, a woman seems less virtuous if she consented to something adjacent to sex, if she participated in a voluntary hookup, than if she didn't consent to anything sexual and just went to see a movie poster in somebody's room. And so again, this could sort of reflect slut-shaming attitudes, negative attitudes towards hookup culture. People could also think of Alicia as a tease if she sort of agreed to hook up with Michael, but then asked to stop. All of this could be contributing to this sort of baseline moral penalty of adjacent consent. And then we can also see that adjacent consent is undermining this virtuous victim effect or tendency to morally elevate victims. So if we look at the complete non-consent conditions, we see that people morally elevate victims who haven't consented to anything sexual whatsoever. So Alicia is seen as more morally virtuous when she's sexually assaulted than when she's not sexually assaulted, when she hasn't consented to do anything sexual with Michael. On the other hand, people don't elevate Alicia when she's sexually assaulted if the sexual assault follows from an initially consensual interaction. And so we find this interaction between adjacent consent and victim status, highlighting that adjacent consent is preventing people from morally elevating the victim. So sort of putting these two things together, returning to the question of why adjacent consent makes sexual assault victims seem less virtuous, we see that there are these two distinct mechanisms. First, adjacent consent is carrying a baseline moral penalty where even in the absence of sexual assault, some people are sort of disapproving morally of the consensual sexual activity that occurred. And then we also find that adjacent consent is undermining the virtuous victim effect or preventing people from morally elevating Alicia. We find that if a sexual assault occurs, people don't show this virtuous victim psychology. So what we did next is we asked if these two distinct mechanisms would show up and sort of generalize to other contexts. So the first thing we did is we used a different vignette that also manipulated victim status and whether there was adjacent consent, but with a sort of a different background information. And we tested this also on Amazon Turk. So in this vignette, the characters were older, they were in their 20s rather than in college, and there was no party scene where people might imagine drinking was going on. Instead, the vignette occurred in the woman's apartment, and the only people present in the whole vignette are the man and the woman. They also have a different relationship. So in complete non-consent, they're neighbors, and in adjacent consent, they're actually dating, but they haven't yet been sexually intimate. So sort of a different context. And we wanted to see if we would find similar patterns. And so these are the results that we saw. So if we look just at the two non-victim conditions, we can ask whether there's a baseline moral penalty. And we actually did not observe a significant baseline moral penalty for adjacent consent, this time with someone you were dating, in this vignette. We did, however, find that, again, adjacent consent turned off this virtuous victim effect. It prevented people from elevating the victim if she was assaulted. So we see a significant virtuous victim effect in the complete non-consent condition. We don't see this in the adjacent consent condition, and we find a marginally significant interaction. Next, what we did is we took our party vignette, the first vignette I was sort of describing, and we tested it among undergraduates. We initially recruited undergraduates from the University of Michigan, and then when the semester ended, we finished out our pre-registered sample per our pre-registered analysis plan by testing undergraduates on Prolific. So we ended up with about 800 undergraduates, and we were interested if they would sort of see this party vignette in a similar way to the adults on MTurk. And these were the results that we found. So if we look at the non-victim conditions, we actually, again, are not replicating this baseline moral penalty for adjacent consent. In fact, we're finding the reverse effect significantly among undergraduates. So the undergraduates are actively sex positive. They're showing a baseline moral boost to adjacent consent rather than this baseline moral penalty. This could reflect that they're sort of positive on participation in the hookup culture. It could also reflect that they view it positively that Alicia is sort of setting sexual boundaries for herself by consenting to something and then saying when she wants to stop. In any case, we don't find that they're negatively moralizing the sexual activity she consents to in the absence of a sexual assault. Yet even these actively sex positive undergraduates actually show the same effect where virtuous victim effect is undermined by adjacent consent. So they show this large virtuous victim psychology of morally elevating the victim when Alicia hasn't consented to anything sexual with Michael. But when Michael assaults Alicia following an initially consensual interaction, even these sex positive undergraduates are turning off this psychology of elevating her. They're not elevating her following the assault. So together, these results sort of highlight that these two distinct mechanisms are psychologically separable. There are contexts in which we can find support for the second mechanism where adjacent consent prevents people from elevating victims, and yet we don't find any baseline moral penalty for adjacent consent. And this idea that these are psychologically separable is actually further highlighted by analyses of individual difference moderators of these two effects. So what we did is we sort of pooled our data across all the MTurk studies I've talked about so far. So 5 MTurk studies with the party vignette and 1 MTurk study with the apartment vignette. And we asked what individual differences might moderate these two different effects. What we found is that this baseline moral penalty of adjacent consent is actually driven specifically by political conservatives and older individuals. So these types of individuals are the ones with these negative attitudes towards consensual sexual activity in the absence of assault. Yet adjacent consent is sort of much more universally undermining the virtuous victim effect among a wide swath of different demographic subgroups. So looking first to political ideology, I'm now just breaking out the 2x2 I was showing you before by political ideology, dichotomizing people into being more liberal or more conservative. What we see is that liberals don't show any baseline moral penalty within the non-victim conditions for adjacent consent. Conservatives, however, react quite negatively to the adjacent consent, even in the absence of sexual assault. And yet, both liberals and conservatives show this effect where they're morally elevating victims in the complete non-consent condition, and they're not morally elevating victims when there's adjacent consent. We see a similar pattern when we look at age. So if we look at the baseline moral penalty across age groups, we're not seeing it much in people under their 30s. They actually show a directionally positive reaction to adjacent consent in the absence of sexual assault. We're also not seeing much in the 30s and 40s, but in the 50s and in the 60s, we're seeing really strong negative reactions to the sort of consensual sexual activity in the absence of sexual assault. Interestingly, however, all of these different age brackets are showing the same pattern where they morally elevate victims when there's no consent to anything sexual, and they don't do the same thing when there's adjacent consent. And so these results sort of highlight the relative robustness across different types of people of the second mechanism. And as another example of sort of the way this is robust to different demographic features, I'm just going to show the results by gender as well. We can see that both male and female evaluators show the same pattern, where they see somebody as more morally virtuous when she's raped if she didn't consent to anything sexual with the perpetrator, but if she did, they do not morally elevate her. So what I want to do for the rest of this talk is sort of zoom in on this finding that adjacent consent is robustly preventing people from elevating victims, right? We're seeing this in both of our vignettes. We're seeing it even among the sex positive undergraduates. We're seeing it across a wide sort of swath of different demographic subgroups. Why is this happening? So what we did is we sort of asked across a series of different studies about different factors, things about adjacent consent that might explain why adjacent consent is preventing people from morally elevating victims. And so I'm going to walk through each of these studies. So the first thing we asked is, could it be that the key feature of adjacent consent is that it makes the perpetrator seem less immoral? So does adjacent consent undermine the virtuous victim effect because it excuses the perpetrator or his actions? I already showed you that people are less inclined to punish the perpetrator in the scenario where there's adjacent consent, right? They're sort of less angry with Michael when Alicia consented to something sex adjacent. We also saw that people, and you might imagine this is true for a variety of reasons, right? One obvious one is that Michael's actions seem less premeditated if the sexual assault follows from an initially consensual interaction versus when he ambushes her after lying, saying he's going to show her a movie poster. We also see that people rated him as sort of relatively more believing that she consented when there was adjacent consent. So the question is excusing the perpetrator what makes adjacent consent kind of turn off the virtuous victim effect? To test whether this is the key driving factor, what we did is we said, let's modify the complete non-consent condition to make the perpetrator seem similarly less immoral in a different way, not by adding adjacent consent, but in some other way. So how did we modify the complete non-consent condition to make the perpetrator seem less immoral? We edited the victim ending so that the assault was less severe. So instead of saying that Michael forced sexual intercourse on Alicia, we said that Michael forcibly kissed Alicia, aggressively grabbed her breasts, and then let her go. So the magnitude of the assault became less. And so now we can ask sort of how Alicia is sort of perceived, both when she provided adjacent consent and was raped, versus she did not provide any adjacent consent and she was groped in this way. So the first thing I want to do is just show you that this succeeded at getting rid of the design feature where the perpetrator seems more immoral in the complete non-consent condition than the adjacent consent condition. So when we compare the complete non-consent condition with a less severe assault, we now find that people rate Michael's behavior to be sort of similarly an outrage across these two conditions, with or without adjacent consent. When we ask how bad of a person Michael is, we actually see that people are rating Michael as a morally worse person in the case where there's adjacent consent, but a more severe assault. So it's no longer true that adjacent consent is sort of paired with a less bad perpetrator. And yet we find the same basic pattern. So even with the less severe assault, in the complete non-consent condition, when Alicia is groped, she's seen as more morally virtuous than when she's not victimized. So we get this moral elevation of the victim. On the other hand, we still do not get a moral elevation of the victim in the adjacent consent condition, and we find a marginally significant interaction. So this study sort of suggests the reason that virtuous victim effect is undermined by adjacent consent is not just because it makes the perpetrator seem less immoral. When we make the perpetrator seem less immoral without introducing adjacent consent, we're still getting this same virtuous victim effect. Next, we asked if another factor might be explaining why adjacent consent revokes the virtuous victim effect. In particular, we wanted to know, is it because adjacent consent creates implied consent to sex? So when Alicia agrees to hook up with Michael, people might sort of see her as implying that she's going to have sex with him and later revoking that implied consent to sex. And we wanted to know, is this really what's undermining the virtuous victim effect rather than the adjacent consent, something sort of related to sex that isn't sex? So to find out, we modified the adjacent consent vignette to avoid any implication that Alicia wants to have sex with Michael. So how do we do this? We changed the complete non-consent condition. This is the movie poster version. This is the version, excuse me. We modified the adjacent consent condition, not the complete non-consent condition. So this is not the movie poster version. This is the version where they hook up. And we modified it so that before they go upstairs to his bedroom, they actually kiss downstairs, and then Michael suggests they go upstairs to the bedroom, and Alicia says she's willing to go upstairs, but he should know that she doesn't want to go all the way with him tonight. So Alicia makes pretty clear she's not implying consent to sex by engaging sexually with Michael. We also make clear that when they start hooking up, things progress, although not to the point of having sex, right? So in no way does she ever undermine her initial declaration that she's not interested in having sex tonight. And then we use the same standard ending where he either does or does not sexually assault her after she asks to stop. And we find in this modified design that we still get a virtuous victim effect in the complete non-consent condition, and we don't get a virtuous victim effect in the adjacent consent condition, and we get a marginally significant interaction. So these results suggest we get the same pattern of results even when there really is just adjacent consent and not implied consent to sex, suggesting that implied consent to sex is not why adjacent consent is revoking the virtuous victim effect. Next, we wanted to ask, does adjacent consent matter because it creates sort of sexual interest in the perpetrator is conveyed by the adjacent consent? So when Alicia consents to hook up with Michael, this reveals she's interested in him sexually, which might seem to make the assault less unwanted, right? So maybe people aren't showing the virtuous victim effect when there's adjacent consent because they don't think Alicia is enough of the victim because she didn't truly not want to be assaulted. So to test whether this is what's going on, we added a third condition. And in this third condition, there's still no adjacent consent, but we create sort of uncommunicated sexual interest in the perpetrator. And we asked, did this revoke the virtuous victim effect in the same way that adjacent consent does? So in this new condition, it built off the complete non-consent condition. This is the movie poster version. But we added in to the reader the information that Alicia had uncommunicated sexual interest in Michael. So while Alicia doesn't flirt with Michael, he has no idea whether she's attracted to him, she doesn't hook up with him. The reader learns that she was interested in hooking up with him, although she didn't want to have sex with him, right? So they learn that she was interested in doing what happens in the adjacent consent condition, but this is totally uncommunicated. And we can ask, does conveying sexual interest in this way revoke the virtuous victim effect? So with these three conditions, we find the same basic pattern that I've been talking about with our standard complete non-consent condition and adjacent consent condition. Now the question is, are we going to get the virtuous victim effect in the complete non-consent condition that adds in sexual interest? And the answer is yes, right? We still are seeing that people morally elevate Alicia if they knew she was interested in Michael, but she did not convey that information to him. And this effect is no smaller than it is in the standard complete non-consent condition. We do find that there's a baseline moral penalty for this uncommunicated sexual interest. So if we look just at the non-victim conditions, just like adjacent consent sort of reduces Alicia's perceived morality in the absence of sexual assault, the same is true for this uncommunicated sexual interest. But while people are sort of negatively moralizing this uncommunicated sexual interest at baseline, it is not revoking the virtuous victim effect like adjacent consent did. So these results suggest that it's not about sort of conveying perceived sexual interest. Okay, so I'm going to go through the last of these pretty quickly. So we looked at sort of two other factors like sexual interest in the same 3x2 design. So the next one was perceived promiscuity, right? Is it the case that adjacent consent undermines the virtuous victim effect because it conveys that the victim is a promiscuous person and people kind of see promiscuous people as ineligible to be virtuous victims? To test this, we added a third condition, like the third condition I just talked about, except this time we're adding evidence of promiscuity without creating adjacent consent. So how did we do this? Essentially, what we did is we modified our movie poster scenario where Alicia does not consent to anything sexual with Michael. And we said that last weekend, Alicia consented to something with a man named Jonathan that's much like what she consents to in the adjacent consent condition. So we say she'd been to this fraternity before, she flirted with a classmate named Jonathan, ended up hooking up with him at the frat house, but they didn't have sex. Basically, she did exactly what she does with Michael in the adjacent consent condition with somebody else. And so the question is, does making her seem like a promiscuous person without creating adjacent consent with Michael mean that people stop morally elevating her if Michael sexually assaults her? So again, these are the sort of standard conditions you're used to seeing. The question is, what's going to happen in this new third condition? And we find that in this new third condition, people do show the virtuous victim effect, right? So if Alicia's previously hooked up with Jonathan and now Michael sexually assaults her, people morally elevate her, suggesting that adjacent consent is, and we're finding this effect is just as big, this moral elevation, as it would be in our standard complete non-consent condition. Suggesting that adjacent consent is not undermining the virtuous victim effect simply by making the victim seem like a promiscuous person. We do again find that this sexual history information carries a baseline moral penalty, just like adjacent consent. So again, these sort of baseline moral penalty mechanism is being separated out from when somebody is morally elevated. And then the final study is sort of structurally the same. So we have one more factor about, does adjacent consent matter because the victim sort of assumes the risk of victimization, right? Is the reason that adjacent consent prevents people from morally elevating victims because adjacent consent is sort of seen as you voluntarily took on the risk of being sexually assaulted. If you choose to hook up with someone at a frat party, like maybe you're taking on the risk that something bad could happen. Now we don't want to elevate you if something bad does happen. So we added a third condition where the victim put herself at risk, but without adjacent consent. And the way that we did this is we said that Alicia knew the frat had a certain reputation, that it was notorious on campus for the bad behavior of its members. She's heard several stories about allegations of sexual assault at this frat. Her male friends have warned her it's not the safest place for women, but she decides to attend this frat party anyway because she wants to have fun. So this is a way she's sort of taking on risk of being assaulted without adjacent consent. And we find the same pattern of results where there's sort of a significant virtuous victim effect in this new complete non-consent condition that adds in the assumption of risk. So unlike adjacent consent, this other form of taking on risk is not undermining the moral elevation of victims. The effect size of the virtuous victim effect is again similar to what we get in the standard complete non-consent condition. Although there's again a baseline moral penalty here. People at baseline are reacting negatively to her taking on this risk, even when she's not sexually assaulted. But if she is assaulted, having to knowingly taken on risk without providing adjacent consent is not canceling this adjacent consent psychology. So we're sort of, again, not finding support for this as an explanation for the virtuous victim effect. So to wrap up the sort of key conclusions from these set of studies, we find that one important factor that can reduce support for victims of sexual assault is whether or not the victim consented to something adjacent to sex with her perpetrator. And we find this happens for two reasons. The first is that political conservatives and older individuals sort of tend to disapprove of the sexual activity that was consented to, even in the absence of sexual assault. So this is sort of slut-shaming attitudes that are there regardless of whether an assault occurs. And then our sort of key novel theoretical contribution is the second mechanism, that adjacent consent prevents people from morally elevating victims if they're sexually assaulted. And crucially, this is holding even among political liberals, young people, even sex-positive undergraduates. And this latter mechanism really doesn't seem to be about other factors you might imagine are driving that are sort of associated with adjacent consent. So it's not about making the perpetrator less immoral. It's not about implied consent to sex. It's not about conveying sexual interest in the perpetrator. It's not about making the victim seem like a promiscuous person. It's not about her taking on risk. It seems to really be about adjacent consent per se, and none of these sort of associated factors that we could test and show they don't behave like adjacent consent. And so we conclude that what's probably going on is that people are sort of overextending the adjacent consent. And this is why it's preventing them from morally elevating victims. And the idea here is that people often talk about consent in moral philosophy as being moral magic, right? It can transform rape into intercourse. It can transform trespass into hospitality. It can sort of transform assault into a voluntary elective surgery. And it seems like when a woman consents to something adjacent to sex and then is forcibly raped, while people agree that she is a victim of rape and that her perpetrator should be severely punished, they don't see her as the kind of victim that deserves moral uplift, suggesting that they're sort of overextending the consent that she did provide. And we sort of suggest this is kind of consistent with a growing body of work on the moral psychology of consent, suggesting that people are sort of readily attributing consent, even in cases where this seems normatively questionable. So for example, my co-author on this work, Rosanna Summers, has shown that if I lie to you to gain your consent, and getting your consent really relies on me to tell this lie, people might think I'm a bad person. They still think you consented. We might kind of think of this as a over attribution of consent as well. And so this work suggests another way this happens is that we sort of overextend adjacent consent, and that it may have implications for when we support victims of sexual assault. So thank you so much for your attention, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Julian. Can people hear me?
I'm going to go ahead and pin Laura. We're going to hold off on questions until Laura's given her commentary, and then we're going to go right from the commentary to the questions. I know we suggested something slightly different originally, that Jillian was going to respond, but I think it makes more sense for us just to get right to the Q&A. So I will, let me pin you, Laura, so that you're
Okay.
perfect.
All right.
You're up.
Great. So thank you, Jillian, so much for doing this work. This work on adjacent consent, it does not seem like easy work. I want to talk about a few things. So I guess just to review what you found, because there's a lot in there. And also to look at some of the open questions about why, and also just a question for you about, where else we might see this effect. So, but just first, I did want to mention, I don't know about you, but this adjacent consent idea, I think it's been buried in the intuitions of every girl in high school and through college and, really through womanhood. And it means a lot that you chose to study it and explain it in this really clear way. And one thing I do want to actually hear from you about is sort of about the applied aspect. Like, how do you think this information should be disseminated? How could this work reach people who aren't scientists and who kind of worry about this problem? Okay, so as far as the what, you can correct me. As I understand it, we saw that you established the virtuous victim effect in earlier work, which makes a general claim about what victims seem to signal about morality, which is this increased positive moral character, victimhood. And you investigated why it seems like this doesn't always hold in some cases. And you showed us that the adjacent consent effect really effectively seems to explain why it seems to get washed out. And this adjacent victim consent effect is essentially saying yes to an act adjacent to the crime, which eliminates the positive effect of being a crime victim on moral character perceptions. And you showed that it washes it out across age, across political orientation, gender of participants. So we saw all of that evidence. And so apparently in this moral dyad of agent and patient, the perfect moral patient seems to be like fully and historically prohibiting similar acts. The perfect moral patient is never consenting, not, just non-consenting. I think this, work is obviously really exciting, and it opens the doors for more research that kind of clarifies why we're seeing this adjacent consent effect in its boundaries. As far as why, you told us about a lot of different reasons why it might happen and how you studied them. So a lot were already covered here. I think the first thing that comes to mind is this sort of baseline moral penalty piece that people are being judgmental about casual sexual activity, and this is factoring in there. And that was really surprising. It's less important than you might think. The adjacent consent effect washed out the virtuous victim effect, even for the sex positive undergrad sample, which, that rings true with my students and the sorts of things that they worry about. You ruled out a bunch of other possible explanations, like perceived perpetrator immorality, victim implied consent, perceived romantic interest, her sort of perceived promiscuity, like a character level kind of promiscuity. And this assumption of risk, like she took a risk and so she kind of deserved it. And I think what's interesting here, so in my work, I've found that, people who focus on the perpetrator when they're doing moral judgment of victims and perpetrators in sexual assault scenarios, they're less likely to blame victims and hold them accountable. They're more likely to think, about, okay, what did the perpetrator do that might have causally contributed to this outcome? But people don't do that often. So people are more likely to think counterfactually about victims and what they could have done in these situations, not perpetrators. And I actually think this extends a lot. And I'm guilty of it. In researchers, we don't want to think about perpetrators. We don't want to think about that kind of ugly mind or sort of motivations that are difficult to think about. And what I appreciate is that several of the potential whys that you tested had to do with perpetrator motivation. I think that what's interesting is that you're showing that it might be more nuanced. If it's possibly more nuanced about the perpetrator's mental states, how the perpetrator is experiencing this, feeling confusion, desperation, some other epistemic or emotional state that people feel is unfair or humiliating and gives him moral credit. So I think that there's, a lot of interesting work to do around the perpetrator. And I was really glad to see that you were already digging in there. And then the last piece, I guess, where else might we find this adjacent consent effect? For theft, I was thinking of your iPad theft and your idea theft. Are there cases where we lend regularly before we are robbed? So I'm just interested in how you're thinking about this and if it can extend. So thank you for an amazing talk and congratulations again on being the first Gil Harmon Award winner. Thanks, Jillian.
Thank you, Laura. All right, I'm going to unpin you and repin Jillian, and she can. I'll make sure I field the questions, and then she can answer them. Give me 1 second. Get everything set up. Okay, so Meltem, you're up. Oh, I got to unmute you. Yeah, sorry.
Well, Jillian, thank you so much for a great talk. I was also curious about how much of this is people just not liking those who change their minds halfway in, and I'm wondering if baseline moral penalty might still apply to them. So if I say I'm going to be donating a blood, and halfway in I decide to say no, but the person collecting my blood still collects the blood, will people still perceive me as a little bit blameworthy? Or if I give someone my, if I give them a cookie or give them a dress and then say, actually, I really love that dress, I'm going to take it back. So would people also judge that person harsher? Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. And also thank you so much, Laura, for that really interesting commentary. I really appreciate it. So I totally think that the changing mind penalty is sort of like one mechanism that may be contributing to the baseline moral penalty. I think that if it's part of the explanation, it would fit into the baseline moral penalty rather than the part where adjacent consent turns off the virtuous victim effect, because the idea is that in the non-victim conditions, Alicia also changes her mind in the adjacent consent version of the vignette. So I think that when we sort of see this baseline moral penalty, it could basically reflect a couple of things. One of them is a penalty for changing her mind. And then one is maybe they don't like hookup culture, they don't like casual sexual activity, anything around that. I think that when we think about the changing of the mind idea, it could be kind of domain general, like you suggested, maybe we generally would feel negatively about partial and then withdrawn consent in these non-sexual examples you gave. I think we could also imagine sort of a domain specific version of that, which is what I was sort of alluding to when I brought up attitudes about women who tease men. We might imagine people are perfectly fine with you consenting to something partial and incomplete in other domains, but in the sexual domain, people are seeing the woman as teasing the man in a negative way. So I think that it's like interesting to think about, if this is a contributor to the baseline moral penalty, how domain specific or general that is. But yeah, I definitely think that could be part of it. And I also think on the flip side, like when the undergraduates have this positive reaction to adjacent consent at baseline, it may be about being positive on her boundary setting, right? Like they think it's good that she consented to something, but then said to stop after. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Eric, you can unmute yourself. And just as a reminder to everybody who may have come in late, if you ask a question, make sure you leave your hand raised until the end so you don't disappear into the void of other people. So once it's all done, you can put your hand down. That'd be great. Thanks. Go ahead, Eric.
Thanks, Jillian. Interesting talk. I wanted to invite you to reply directly to Laura's last question, which was one that I also had, which is about how would extend to other domains. Not mind changing, but I was thinking of two cases in particular. One where a loan becomes theft, right? You consent to loan someone money for a certain amount of time, or your object for a certain amount of time, and then they just keep it. That would be adjacent consent. Or maybe say where you agree to wrestle with somebody, but then it becomes physical assault, right? So would you predict the same kind of effects for those non-sexual types of cases?
Yeah, so this is a great question. I am excited that you're both asking it. I think that this is like the number one thing we're sort of most excited about as a next direction with this line of work, is exactly asking if adjacent consent undermines this moral elevation of victims in other domains. I won't really speculate beyond saying, like, I think it's totally psychologically plausible to me. I've thought of a bunch of examples, including this sort of lending something becomes theft one that you both mentioned. I think there's a lot of interesting cases to investigate, and I could totally see it being domain general. I think it could tell us something. It could sort of support the idea that the underlying explanation for our results is something broader about our moral psychology of consent and our readiness to attribute it, even in normatively questionable cases, if we saw that it wasn't specific to the sexual domain. So yeah, I don't know yet, but we really are planning to look into that and think it's super interesting. Thanks.
Perfect. Okay, Alex, let me unmute you. You can unmute yourself. There we go.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I also had the question about generality of this effect if it extends outside of the sexual domain. But my other question was about another factor to add on this long list. And I feel like maybe it's captured in one of these previous factors that you talked about. It's like this idea is kind of similar to this idea that the victim is complicit in them being a victim. But I think it's a little distinct, which is like this idea that men can't control themselves sexually, which I feel like comes up a lot in this discourse about sexual assault, and not just in American culture, but other cultures as well. It's like similar to the idea that the victim is at fault for like what she wears or how she behaves. But like, it seems like somewhat differently is this idea that once you get this ball running, it's just like, men can't pull back, I guess. And that's kind of related to adjacent consent, right? Like she's kind of riling him up maybe, and maybe that's a factor as well. I just wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, great question. So I think that logic totally makes sense as something that might explain why the perpetrator is seen as less deserving of punishment when there's adjacent consent. It's sort of what I was alluding to, but I didn't spell it out as well as you did when I talked about, like, maybe people think it was less premeditated when the sexual assault occurs in the context of an initially consensual interaction. Like they may just think, now he's in this aroused state, and so it's less blameworthy than when he kind of planned this out before without anything sexual having happened. I think that our results do have this interesting feature of suggesting that seeing the perpetrator as less immoral is not enough to explain why adjacent consent prevents people from morally elevating the victim when she's assaulted. And I think the thing that highlights that is that when we made the perpetrator seem less immoral by making the magnitude of the assault less severe, instead of by introducing adjacent consent, like they did see Michael in that condition as a less bad person than when there was adjacent consent and there was a more severe assault. And yet they still showed a virtuous victim effect, and they did not when there was adjacent consent. So I think that the work kind of highlights that, like, how bad of a guy Michael is actually not all there is to it in terms of whether or not we morally elevate the victim, which I do think kind of points to this interesting connection again with some of the broader research around the moral psychology of consent. Like I mentioned, my co-author Rosanna Summers has shown that people think there's consent even if I have to lie to you and deceive you to get your consent. And this is kind of another case where if I have to lie to you and deceive you to get your consent, people think I'm a pretty bad person, but then they still think you've consented and that there's kind of moral implications of the fact that you've consented. Like this moral magic applies. If, you know, I deceive you and you consent, then people, you know, don't see you as like, you know, if I'm a surgeon and I lie to you to get your consent, people don't see you as having been assaulted by me the way they would if you didn't consent and I perform surgery on you. So I think that it's sort of another case where like how bad the perpetrator is like not the same thing as if we're getting if we're getting this virtuous victim psychology to turn off. But I do think that what you mentioned about the perpetrator controlling themselves is sort of one of the mechanisms through which adjacent consent makes the perpetrator seem less bad, for sure.
Good. Thank you, Alex. It's a good question. Andy, let me let you unmute yourself there.
Great. Thanks, Jillian. This was a super interesting talk. I've got kind of a similar question to a lot of people, but I think a little twist on it, which is that there might be degrees of adjacency. So if the victim agrees to hold their hand as opposed to make out with them or something, like what is sort of the boundary condition? Yeah. And I thought about like in other domains, like suppose I hire a gardener and they ruin my hedges. But like I only hired them to water the plants or something. Like, is that enough to create this sort of adjacency effect? Yeah, so I think extending it to other domains will be super interesting, and then playing around with well, exactly how adjacent does it have to be in order to generate this effect?
Totally. Yeah. Unfortunately, we don't have like a data-based answer to that question because we don't have like the holding hand study. I do share the intuition that if it's not close enough at some point, it's going to stop turning off the virtuous victim effect. That being said, I didn't have the intuition that hooking up with someone and then being raped by them would turn off the virtuous victim effect. So like, I don't know. I mean, I think you could kind of think of the uncommunicated sexual interest as like an extreme minimal thing that didn't turn off the virtuous victim effect. But I think it's a great direction to kind of look at exactly how much has to happen. And I do think it's kind of relevant for thinking about the practical implications of some of this work as well. So I agree, this is important to understand. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you, Andy, for a good question. Diego, you're up next. What you got? Let me unmute you. There we go.
Thanks. Can you hear me, Joe?
Yes.
Awesome. Hi. So cool stuff. I just had a quick question. I think it's a little bit related to Trisha's comment in the chat, where I was thinking about people's assumptions of like what her consent, like what she should have known better, right? Like what her consent implies. So it got me thinking about like boundary conditions where I was like, do you see this when you vary the age of the victim, where like she's like a 10-year-old and consented, and it's like, did her understanding of consent still have that adjacent consent effect? Whereas like our like patriarchal assumptions of assent for women apply for like adults who like have like fully formed and have, but if we like do it with kids, I mean, there's a whole like, you know, they'll have a whole other penalties of like, you know, pedophile stuff, whatever. But like that idea of like agency and intention built into the consent that the adjacent consent that she's given. So I was curious, like, have you looked at it in kids or even with people with like mental illnesses, where like it's like more unstable and maybe like their understanding of what that consent meant at the time, or what we think their consent meant at the time. So I was kind of curious your thoughts on that.
Great question. We haven't looked at within this project, we haven't looked at anything that I think would speak to that directly. I mean, I would really certainly hope that people don't think the adjacent consent of a 10-year-old has any implications for whether they would elevate her if she were a victim. But I don't know, that would be horrifying, but it would be also, yeah, an important question for sure. I think that the one thing that I am aware of that's sort of an empirical evidence that might speak to what you're getting at that's interesting is some of Rosanna Summers' other work, again, outside of this sort of sexual assault victim context, but about some of the ways that people over-attribute consent. And one of her papers, she looks at whether people think there's consent when someone either doesn't have the capacity for rational decision-making, or when they do have the capacity for rational decision-making, but they choose not to exercise it. And I believe I'm getting this right. I think what she finds is that people still see there as being consent if someone has the capacity but chooses not to exercise sort of a rational decision-making process when granting consent. But if someone like doesn't have that capacity at all, then they don't think there was consent. So I can imagine that being relevant to this question about young children, and perhaps most directly relevant to your question about mental illness or other things that would interfere with making kind of reasoned decisions. Like, I think that there is evidence that people feel like if you don't have the capacity at all to do that, your consent is not so, it's not possible to give consent. Your consent maybe isn't so meaningful if you give it. So I think that that would sort of be like a theoretical reason we might expect that if it was a child providing the adjacent consent, or someone who was unable to sort of meaningfully consent, that it wouldn't look the same. Great question, though.
Okay, so there are 3 hands raised. I want to ask a question. I don't think we have time for everybody. So what I will do, and then I'm going to say, like, if Rebecca, you can ask the question, I'll get you to unmute in a second. Michelle and Rui, I think maybe if you don't mind, I'll get you to add your question to the chat, and then I'll ask a quick question, and that'll be the last. I'll take the liberty of asking the question at the very end. Okay, Rebecca, go ahead. Let me unmute you.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I had kind of 2 questions. Can you mute that for a second so I don't hear myself echoing? So one is, I just wanted a point of clarity with some of your research, because I think it helps me understand some of the implications. So you talked about how people who identified as sex positive still kind of had these sort of biases. And I'm just curious what we mean by sex positive, because, you know, there are people who kind of, like, if they see something multiple choice, are like, yeah, I like sex. I think sex is good. And then there are people who are like, I identify fully as a sex positive feminist. And I think that those potentially can be very different groups. And I think it's kind of interesting either way you slice it, but I am just sort of curious, you know, because a lot of people have sort of really empty ideas about how enjoying sex is about helping, is about, you know, servicing men, or, you know, whatever it is. And then the other thought I had was just a concern, and maybe you speak to this. I think the idea with the frat parties of having, you know, the idea of her going into a dangerous frat party in a bad place, and that being something of concern versus something that doesn't have a bad reputation. My concern with that is that, you know, the initial example of just a regular frat party, that frat parties in general have bad reputations. And you don't necessarily need to say they have a bad reputation to get that effect.
Great, thank you so much for the question. So on the first one, sorry if this wasn't clear. So we're actually not asking people to self-report their sex positivity, but inferring it from the baseline moral effect of adjacent consent in the absence of a sexual assault. So I shared my screen again, just in case it helps to clarify. So this is the undergraduate sample. And if we look just at the non-victim conditions, so basically comparing their ratings of Alicia, if she either hooks up with Michael and then asks to stop and then he stops, or Michael offers to show her the movie poster, she agrees, she sees the poster, and that's the end of the story. So there's no assault in either case, but either she hooks up with Michael or she just sees a movie poster. They actually rate her as more moral when she hooks up with Michael than when she sees the movie poster. So instead of showing the like baseline moral penalty of this consensual sexual interaction that ends without incident, they're showing a positive effect of it. So this is why I was labeling them as sex positive, sort of revealed through this between subjects effect. It's not about any specific individual, but then it's sort of striking that within this exact same population, we're still getting this pattern where we see the virtuous victim effect when there's no consent to anything sexual, but when there's this consensual sexual interaction that's evaluated positively at baseline, it's turning off the moral elevation of victims. So that's what I meant there. And then with respect to your second question, I think that it's totally true that people probably perceived some amount of kind of risk taking by going to the frat party, even in the standard complete non-consent condition where we didn't add in all this information about how she knew that it was a dangerous place for women where there's bad reputation and you know, sexual assaults occurred. We did have a manipulation check item where in that study across the 3 conditions are standard complete non-consent, the modified one where she knows it's a dangerous place for women, and the adjacent consent. We asked people like, how much did Alicia voluntarily put herself in a situation where she risks being assaulted? Like, how much did she knowingly do that? How much should she have known she was doing it? How much did she do it? Like various questions about taking on risk. And what we find is that if we compare the standard adjacent consent and the standard complete non-consent conditions, people do think she's taking on more risk when she hooks up with Michael than when she doesn't, but that they actually think she's taking on the most risk when we modify the standard vignette to talk on and on about how she knows it's a dangerous place. So it sort of mattered to people's judgments of risk to say what we said. And even though they actually saw her as taking on the most risk in that condition, you know, we still find that in that condition where she doesn't provide any consent to anything sexual with Michael, if she's assaulted, she's morally elevated. So I think it provides quite strong evidence that the reason adjacent consent is undermining this virtuous victim effect and preventing people from elevating her if she's assaulted is not about just generally thinking she assumed the risk, but something specific about adjacent consent in particular. I hope that helps to clarify. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, so this is more a suggestion, I guess, or I think it's related to what Andy said in the chat, which is compare the condition where you describe she knows that she's walking into like the den of vipers, you know, and so she runs the risk knowingly. But you might also, this is related to the question that was just asked, I guess, too. You could think, well, she doesn't know, she's new to campus, she doesn't know that they're horrible. But like she could have known. It's like a case of negligence. Right. Andy said recklessness, but you might think just a case of negligence will do the trick. The sort of, well, she didn't know, but she should have known.
Right.
And that might itself be enough. So it might be that the bar is low enough to like cover something like negligence. It doesn't even require knowledge or even recklessness for that matter.
Well, I think our data are actually inconsistent with that because because like we know that even when not only should she have known, but she did know in this case where we say we go on and on about how bad it is. Even in that case, we still get the moral elevation of her so long as she didn't consent to something adjacent to sex with Michael. And we actually explicitly included an item about should have known. So we had I see. She did know, she should have known, and also just like how much risk did she take on? And all of that was higher than adjacent consent in the condition where if we say she knows it's a dangerous place. And yet that condition still produced a virtuous victim effect. So I think whatever's going on with adjacent consent preventing people from elevating victims, I don't think it's about thinking she did take on risk or she should have known she was or she did know she was, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jillian. It was a great talk, and I very much appreciate you you being willing to share your studies with us. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay. So, who's up? Manuel is going to be up. We'll wait just a second to give everybody time to catch their breath. Hey, Manuel, do you want to try to share your screen real quick to make sure that's all in working order?
Yeah, let's start with the sound. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Now the hard part. 3 years into using Zoom. This next step is always uncertain.
Look at that.
Oh man, living large now. Okay, So as long as I don't touch anything, we'll be all right.
Yeah, that's right. Don't touch anything. All right, hold on one second. Let me, Santiago, how are you? Good. You're a co-host, so you can unmute yourself now.
Not bad. How are you? Nice to see
Good,
everyone.
good. Yeah, thank you.
So we're here in Montes de Maria doing field work for the Memory and Forgiveness Project.
Oh, amazing.
Pretty cool.
Yeah, it's a very cool project.
Thanks. Excited about it. How's everyone?
Good. Everyone is, I think, well, I can't speak for everyone. I'm doing fine. This has gone smoother than I thought, but that's just because the data blitz is tomorrow. But
it's still good. It's 66 participants and
yeah, there were, I think
not
there was
bad.
as many as 80 at some point. So that was, I had no idea what to expect. So as far as I can tell, that was it's been a success so far.
Well, Thomas, thanks for putting everything together. This is
Sure.
great.
I'm pretty sure we'll be down to about 30 in maybe about 45 minutes.
Yeah, that sounds good. So we'll get started with you. Let me I'm gonna get you to unshare real quick, Manuel, so I can share, so I can do your introduction.
Okay, but let's hope that this will come back.
We'll go ahead and get started just so we can move it along, make sure we have time for you to not have 30 people left. Okay. So now this will be the final talk of the day. This is Manuel Vargas. He's going to give a talk called Adaptive Agency. Manuel is professor of philosophy at the University of California, San Diego. His research focuses on the overlap of moral, psychological, and legal issues concerning human agency and freedom. He also writes about contemporary Latinx philosophy and the history of Mexican philosophy. Vargas is the author of Building Better Beings, A Theory of Moral Responsibility. This is from OUP 2013, which won the American Philosophical Association's Book Prize in 2015. With John Martin Fisher, Robert Kane, and Dirk Pereboom, he co-authored 4 Views on Free Will back in 2007. And with John Doris, he edited the Oxford Handbook of Moral Psychology. And with Gideon Yaffe, he edited Rational and Social Agency, the Philosophy of Michael Bratman. From 2019 to 2021, Vargas and Santiago Amay, who's I was just talking to a second ago, co-directed a $1.2 million project funded by the John Templeton Foundation to foster philosophical work on free will, agency, and responsibility in Latin America. So thanks again, Manuel, for agreeing to do this. And please, everyone, help me welcome him.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it here.
Now you can share.
Okay, well, I don't like sharing. Okay, so let's see here. I think we've got this. Okay, looks okay on your end?
Yep, perfect.
Okay.
Actually, there's one other thing I need to do. I need to pin you. Hold on one second, just to make sure we got this.
It's like prom all over again. I'm getting pinned.
Yeah, that's horrible. Sorry, Manuel. Unshare real quick. It'll be easier. You don't have to do that. You're good. I can get it here.
Okay.
Sorry.
All right. Should I get started?
I'm used to having to do all setting everybody up and setting them sideways and whatever else. Okay. Now you're pinned. Perfect.
Okay. Awesome.
Okay, we're good to go.
All right. Well, so first off, thanks to Thomas for organizing this. I mean, this is really terrific. And, I know the back end of putting together something on this scale is never easy and straightforward. So mad props to Thomas for making all of the magic happen here. In fact, really, I'm just reading a script that Thomas gave me. I mean, that's how much work he gave us, for this conference. He's taking care of all the hard work. Also, I guess I want to thank all of you who are giving up parts of your either Friday afternoons or Friday evenings to be here. So it's great to see everybody. Thanks so much for coming. Okay, so this is a talk on adaptive agency, and part of what we've got to figure out is what the heck that means. But it's really kind of part of a background project, or there is a background project lurking anyway, but behind this one that maybe is useful to say a little bit about before I jump into the details. And it's partly animated by roughly, I mean, this is the big picture version of the thought is, can we reconcile these two different kinds of thoughts or inclinations that people sometimes have? And so one is the kind of relatively recognizable fact that we have differential reactions to agency and its exercise. So sometimes we praise people, sometimes we blame them. We think that they did something admirable, something not so admirable. And in light of these kinds of things, we impose harms, costs, we set back people's interests. We could fight about the precise ways to frame all of these kinds of things, but this here is meant to be relatively neutral about just the kind of spectrum of ways in which we respond to different kinds of exercises of agency, and that we respond to them in these differential ways. So that's the ordinary, pretty pedestrian thought. But then there's also the thought that agency is always at least partly generated by and continuously dependent on the wide social world over which an agent has little or no control. So I think, there are lots and lots of different ways to think about this, but the kinds of things that you're able to do right now, that we're even able to have this conference, for example, depends on a whole bunch of technological infrastructure that makes it possible for us to interact in these kinds of ways. And what sorts of affordances there are, what kinds of roles and socially recognized powers and so on, all of these kinds of things depend on the social world cooperating in a certain kind of way. But then also, as a number of people have noted, that it's not just that, but it's also the kind of contents of our heads look like, in many ways, the sorts of things that we want, the sorts of things that we believe. Oftentimes, it doesn't take a lot of work to trace those things back out into the social world in some way, shape, or form. And so these two thoughts are sometimes thought to be in tension with one another. What's the grounds on which we have these differential reactions to agency if it turns out that many or all of the elements of it can end up getting traced back out either to the social world or maybe to other kinds of things that we similarly don't have control over. And so this is the kind of space in which I'm particularly interested in trying to figure out on what grounds could we say things to explain elements of the first while acknowledging the reality of the second. And so that's the ambition. Of course, this is a familiar problem in a lot of different domains. So for example, in sociology, people talk about it sometimes under the rubric of the agency structure problem. That is, do your explanations that are largely structural or social explanations leave anything by way of agency by the time you're done talking about those things? And of course, in philosophy, maybe the home for a lot of these fights has been in the context of thinking about free will and moral responsibility. Okay, so that's the background that is where, I guess, in some sense, where my interests in these particular issues that are the focus of this talk partly arise out of those background issues. This talk here, though, it is a thankfully narrower focus than that. And in particular, the question I'm interested in is whether or not one can act culpably if one is acting from adaptive preferences. And so there's a bunch of literature on adaptive preferences. So I'll talk a little more about this in a bit. The kind of first wave of this, of the adaptive preferences literature, was fights about the kind of rational permissibility or the rational authority of preferences. Then there was subsequently a lot of work trying to wrestle with whether or not action that flowed from adaptive preferences could be understood to be autonomous, or whether or not adaptive preferences in some sense were an illustration of a mistaken way of thinking about autonomy. Here, I want to ask a question that hasn't gotten a lot of attention. And it's a question that, in some sense, I think is slightly surprising that people haven't spent more time focusing on it. It's not that no one has, but it's a relatively small part of the adaptive preferences literature. And it's about the culpability question. That is, when people have adaptive preferences and they act wrongly, can they be culpable for what they do? That's I think, we could ask the positive version of it, but I think it's the negative version, partly in light of the thought that when we act wrongly, we become vulnerable to setbacks in our interest, that it has a special pinch in the case of adaptive preferences. So that's the central framing question. At a first pass, and here I'm going to come back and revisit exactly what adaptive attitudes are in a moment. I'm going to accept, just for the moment here at the outset, that adaptive attitudes are attitudes that are produced by and expressive of an unjust social order. This, at this point, I think, is a fairly widespread usage of the term, at least in the philosophical literature. And we can fight about what counts as injustice or an unjust social order. For my purposes, I'm interested in including things like oppression, domination, socially induced deprivation. All of these things can be given and have been given more and less strict characterizations about what they come to. So oppression usually appeals to something like systematic disadvantage. Domination usually is roughly something like arbitrary control over somebody else's options or the consequences of selecting amongst options. And then deprivation, of course, is the absence of some or another good. And the socially induced element is to distinguish it from cases where it might just turn out everybody in a community lacks resources, but it's not because the way the society is arranged, but just because of full stop inability to provide the relevant resources, no matter how they arrange the social world. And that looks like a different kind of case than a case where a particular community, for example, suffers deprivation in terms of, say, lack of adequate food or water, not because it's not available collectively, but because there's been some systematically produced on the side of social practices to get rid of it. Okay. So here are the kinds of examples that people will sometimes use to motivate that. So the kind of classic case that shows up in some of Nussbaum's work, cases where people are content with diminished access to medical care based on gender. So might have you can imagine and in fact there have been cases where one gender gets 90% of the medical resources but is deeply unhappy with their medical care. The other gender gets 10% of the medical resources and turns out to be very happy with their level of medical care. The explanation is given in terms of adaptive preferences, that the disadvantaged gender comes to think that it is proper and appropriate that the other group get all of the resources, and so then they're very happy with the limited resources. Other sorts of examples that people have given, people who are satisfied with lack of education or even dismissive of the opportunity to get education. Dudes saying, no, I don't need mental health care because, and then insert stoicism. These look like kind of, they fit some of the profile. And one that might have some pinch for those of us that are giving our Friday afternoons to voluntarily going to an academic talk, the desire to work when there's no financial need to do so. So Michael Cholby thinks this is one example of adaptive preferences. Now here, I should say, I'm imagining most folks are familiar with this, but it maybe bears saying out loud. Adaptive here, this is a technical term that's inherited from an older literature. It doesn't mean adaptationist. So this isn't a point about evolutionary systems. And indeed, in its ordinary usage, one might reasonably complain that maybe what we really should be calling these things are something like maladaptive attitudes. This is just an artifact of the history, but at this point, I think things are too entrenched for us to be able to talk about them in any other ways, even though I think there is a certain kind of infelicity to the way in which it's been set up. Okay, so here are some out of the gate, some challenges to the basic elements of the project. So one is just the problem of variegation. So one thing you might think is, wow, well, look look at this range of things: oppression, which looks like it's going to be super diverse, and domination, and socially induced deprivation. How in the world can we say anything systematic about the way in which those things might impinge on culpability? And so I think some people are, and not unreasonably, it seems to me, skeptical about whether or not there's anything systematic that we can say about these things. Another thing that people will sometimes complain about is that it's not obvious that adaptive attitudes are themselves explanatorily interesting. So one thing you could think in that kind of context is that maybe the real work is happening somewhere else. And I think that for reasons we'll talk about, I think there's something to this kind of worry, but I think that we can get at something in the nearby neighborhood that makes it useful to talk these ways, despite some reasons for some skepticism. Then I think for those of us that are interested in kind of the normative import of these things, so we have this phenomenon, this apparent phenomenon anyway, of adaptive attitudes. And then the worry is what Serene Cotter has called the agency dilemma. It looks like when we turn to questions of culpability, we face this puzzle where it looks like on the one hand, it looks really kind of, as it were, hard-hearted to say that conditions like oppression, domination, or deprivation have no bearing whatsoever on culpability. So that looks like that would just be hard-hearted to say that these terrible kinds of things have no effect on culpability. On the flip side, it looks like there's a sort of failure of due respect or something like that to recognize the possibility that people can be culpable for what they do, even under conditions of oppression. And of course, certainly folks who share similar kinds of conditions living under oppression readily regard one another as culpable. So this is part of the challenge for anybody who wants to talk about adaptive preferences and their normative significance, is to find a way to thread this needle between sort of sweeping exculpation and the hard-heartedness objection. Last thing I'll say here is that, of course, ideally what we would want to do then is to avoid the horns. That is, if we could have a story that tells us something about how or why there might be culpability without going in a strict liability direction, where the thought is, look, we just have a system that's indifferent to things like desert or blameworthiness. Or, can we avoid the maybe there's just no responsibility here at all, or the full exculpation part of the story. Okay, so if you here's what I'm going to end up saying. So after this slide, then you can you've learned the contents of the talk. All right, so in as much as adaptive attitudes are interesting, I think they turn out to be a species of a more general phenomenon that I'm going to call adaptive agency. So I think, yes, we actually can say something systematic. It just turns out that the interest of the attitudes turns out to be parasitic on a more general set of interests, or it's a species of a more general set of interests that we can say something useful about. With respect to the so what question, I think in adaptive attitude cases or adaptive agency cases, part of what makes it interesting and why it feels like there's something explanatorily interesting here is that one's agency ends up being fitted to, and I'm going to use the term somewhat broadly, circumstances of injustice. And one of the ways in which that operates is to make the injustice less apparent. And if it's less apparent, it's less easy to contest. So I think adaptive agency actually plays a certain kind of role in our normative economy in a way. That is, it's one way in which unjust systems shape agents to not complain about the injustice, to not see, to not recognize the injustice. And so I think that's one of the reasons that adaptive attitudes end up being an interesting kind of phenomenon. And I think it's going to turn out that it's compatible with culpability. So I think we're going to be able to avoid the horns of the agency, that we're going to need to say a little bit more. And last, then this is something that only people who are in love with in-house fights about theories of moral responsibility are going to really much care about. But since I'm one of them, it gets the bonus spot on the slide. Thinking about adaptive attitudes is illuminating about some theoretical issues for the foundations of moral responsibility, I think. And so I'll say a little bit about that towards the end. All right, so that's what we're going to do. Here is the phenomenon of interest. So I'll say this very briefly about the kind of twisting ways of talking about adaptive preferences. So way back in '82, Elster had this example from La Fontaine's fox, who had this kind of sour grapes case, where it looks like the fox wants the grapes, then the fox decides, oh, I can't get the grapes, and then the fox decides, I didn't ever want the grapes anyway. And so in that kind of case, part of what Elster thinks is, well, look, it looks like there's something fishy going on in this kind of preference shift sort of case. And amongst other things, it looks like the beginnings of an argument against the authority of preferences. Preferences can shift around in this sort of way. People thought it was interesting. The literature grew up around trying to talk about what rational and irrational preference shifts could look like. But then Sen and Nussbaum later on note that there are these cases where some preferences look like they're relatively clearly products of structural or systemic features in social life. And this was interesting to a number of different people because it looked like maybe we have the beginnings of a story about things that people have talked about under lots of different rubrics: false consciousness, internalized oppressions, distorted desires, and a literature of folks interested in broadly feminist approaches to autonomy began to pick up and discuss this kind of case. And partly in light of that, a relatively new characterization began to emerge, one I'm going to call oddly derived preferences. So here, odd is just an acronym for oppression, domination, and deprivation. And so the idea, so what emerged in that kind of post-Nussbaum style literature was a focus not just on preference shifts. That ceased to be what the issue was. And adaptive attitudes began to be talked about primarily in terms of these attitudes that had a kind of distinctive causal origin that is in conditions of injustice, and that expressed some or were expressive of or supportive of the very things that produce them. And so that way of characterizing it, I think, is at this point has become the standard way of understanding what's going on with adaptive preferences in at least one wing of the literature. And so some of the folks who wrote about this in the context of thinking about theories of autonomy, Mackenzie and Stoliar, O'Shaughnessy, Cotter, and so on. Okay, now, first thing to note here is, I think one of the things that emerges, and it's just, again, an artifact of the history here, is that that the focus on preferences was an artifact of the rational choice theory fights way back when in the 80s. And it was inherited and continued forward by some of the folks working in the feminist autonomy literature. But a very natural question that we should be asking is, well, look, why is it just preferences? Why couldn't it be other kinds of attitudinals or other kinds of attitudes? And I think, you know, there's no reason not to. So I'm inclined to just say, let's just call adaptive, rather than speaking about adaptive preferences as that literature has done. I'm going to continue to talk, as I have been here, about adaptive attitudes in general. That is, any attitude or complex of attitudes that are products that meet that profile of being products of a justice that also express, endorse, affirm, or support unjust features of that social order. So I want to, we don't have to restrict our attention to preferences. We can expand out to other attitudes. That gives us a notion not of just adaptive preferences, but of adaptive attitudes. And then we can say the same thing about other sorts of phenomena that matter for agency. So we could give a story about adaptive capacities, where these are going to be capacities shaped by and expressive of injustice and so on. And then we can say this about agency. So it's just agency in whatever, you know, the combination of its elements, the psychological elements, and then, you know, the capacities, however we understand these as psychological or metaphysical. And then we say, you know, agency that's been subject to adaptive attitudes or adaptive capacities, that gets us to adaptive agency. So this is going to be how I regiment the talk going forward for the rest of the talk here. And I think there are going to be some things that we can do once we start talking in that way. The other thing here I'll note is that that this is a story that allows scalarity all over the place. That is, you might imagine that people have more and less adaptive attitudes, that the population of the attitudes that are adaptive could be that, you know, that they have more adaptive attitudes rather than less adaptive attitudes. Capacities might be rendered adaptive, that is, ways of seeing and responding to the world. Sensibilities, your abilities might have been rendered adaptive to greater and lesser degrees, and so same thing with adaptive agency. So I think lots of ways to build out a kind of scalar story here. Okay, so a couple of things I want to just say here at the outset by way of distinction. In focusing on adaptive agency, the idea here is not that the only way for things to go bad for you as an agent is that you're an adaptive, you know, that your agency is adaptive. That is, you could be a bad person without suffering from adaptive agency. Maybe you're inauthentic, whether or not you're suffering from adaptive agency. You could be heteronymous or non-autonomous. There might be a lot of different ways that things could go badly for you. And so the story here I want to tell about adaptive agency isn't supposed to exclude the possibility of other kinds of stories about defects to agency, and defects that might be really important to us and maybe in a variety of different ways more important, depending on the context, than cases of adaptive agency. Still, I think there are reasons to care about adaptive agency. So I think we tend to think that these conditions that produce it, the oppression, domination, deprivation, are deleterious for normative agency, for the kinds of agency we want to be, the kinds of agency we aspire to have. And I think, and this was the thing I gestured at the outset, that I think adaptive agency functions so as to make injustice's effects less visible to victims and observers. So that is, you know, think about the way in which people are prepared to defer to other people's preferences. Well, you know, so that's what she wants. And so I think one of the interesting things about this phenomenon is the way in which it shapes people in ways that hide or obscure what's doing the work here on this account, it being, of course, the injustice. But this, I think, is a kind of an important thought, is that one thing you could end up thinking is that, well, look, that one is suffering from adaptive agency in some way, shape, or form. it doesn't always impair. And that is, it might turn out that the thing that you have, this adaptation you've acquired in the relevant sense here, doesn't prevent you from doing things that you want, or doesn't prevent you from pursuing goals that you ought to have, or things that you value. And in fact, you may end up with patchy versions of what impairments there are. So, suppose you live under patriarchy, and patriarchy trains you up to perform gender in certain kinds of ways that are conducive to male advantage. You might still think that the sense in which it has induced impairments to people might be only in these places, but not in these places. It doesn't always have to be ubiquitous or across the board in all possible domains. And crucially, I think, and this is another important feature about thinking about adaptive agency, it doesn't require that you be socially subordinate. It might turn out that people who enjoy considerable amounts of social power and aren't in any interesting way socially subordinate or marginalized might still nevertheless be adaptive agents if it turns out their attitudes and capacities have been, as it were, trained up by an unjust system, and then continue to be expressive of the system. So I think this is a distinctive feature about it that looks like it's importantly different than false consciousness. So the kind of traditional conception of false consciousness is you're a member of a subordinate class, you take on values that are beneficial to the ruling class, and they're not really in your interest. So that looks like it requires a certain kind of position in social hierarchy that at least on this characterization of adaptive agency, we don't need to have. Last, it might turn out that adaptive agency can undermine some appealing forms of agency, like autonomy, without undermining everything else. So I think this is an open question about what the relationship is of having adaptive attitudes to a range of forms of agency that might be valuable to us. Autonomy, authenticity, responsibility, and so on. Okay, so it's not intended to rule out some of these other kinds of things, and I think they're interesting questions to be asked about how these things overlap and interact, and what to say when some of the elements conflict. Okay, so here I want to talk about some cases. So to start thinking about like ways in which these things might matter for culpability. So way back when, Susan Wolf, in a really kind of interesting piece back in 1987, Sanity and the Metaphysics of Responsibility, gives us an example of Jojo, son of Joe. And so Jojo's a terrible person. He delights in causing harm to other people and treats people really systematically badly, and does and like fully identifies with what he's doing. Like there's no divided personality about it. He's just full on committed to terrorizing the members of his community. The twist is, and so Wolf is doing this as part of a kind of generating a counterexample to a certain approach to thinking about responsibility that focuses on whether or not people identify with the action or whether or not the action is expressive. But Wolf's twist is that it turns out that Jojo was raised to be, he was born to be bad. His father raised him, Joe, the tyrant, raised him in a way to systematically squelch any knowledge of, interest in, ability to track the nature of the true and the good. So Jojo's been detached from the opportunity to learn moral values in whatever shape or way or form they occur. And Jojo's just been prevented from having any access to that. And so there's a way in which Jojo is just dead to morality, even though he identifies robustly with all of the terrible things that he does. So there's one kind of case, and so Wolf thinks that what's going on in this case is you have somebody who's cut off from at least the good, and maybe they're both the true and the good, especially if there's truths about the good. But anyway, so closed off from the true and the good. But then the thought is supposed to be that because of this, that Jojo's not culpable, and that what Jojo needs is to have some connection to what reasons there are, whether the true reasons or the reasons of the good, in order to be culpable. And so identification alone isn't enough. Now, one of the things that I think is really interesting about this case is that it looks like a kind of toy version of an adaptive attitudes case. But it's not presented that way. The literature hasn't talked about it in that way, but it has a lot of the same features that we would want in a story about adaptive agency. That is, you've got the unjust social order is Joe, the tyrant, the ruler of the country, his having total power over his son and his son's upbringing, domination about how what kinds of incentives there are for doing things and the costs of not doing them. So I think that's the case of JoJo. So here I want to sneak up onto the point I want to make here by thinking about a similar kind of case, and this is going to be the case of Bobo. So Bobo also has a similarly totalizing socialization, except the difference is Bobo's, for lack of a better way to characterize it, Bobo's normative capacities are intact. So that is, Bobo has a tyrannical father like JoJo, except that Bobo's father's not particularly concerned about squelching the ability to track whatever the moral concerns, values, properties are. And so in that kind of case, we end up with somebody who, despite socialization that could go very badly and that's got some of these same kinds of structures of authoritarian control above it, but nevertheless permits the normative capacities to be intact. Okay, so we've got the JoJo case, things go badly, the Bobo case where bad social context, but still normative capacities emerge intact. Here, I think, by stipulation, we can just stipulate that Bobo ends up having the ordinary array of defects. But I think, at least on the face of it, Bobo looks like a better candidate for blame and credit. Right? So the thought is both have massive socialization, but one socialization eliminates the kind of normative capacities or the ability to recognize and respond to normative values. Let's just focus on moral values for the moment. And then in the Bobo case, those things, big socialization, but those things remain intact. Okay, one more case. And maybe I think this case gets us closer to a real world case, not the kind of tyrannical JoJo Bobo cases. But this is Shosho. So Shosho lives in a morally variegated world. Aspects of it are more and less just. And their life and the lives of their friends and family are products of the morally variegated nature of that world. Shosho has some adaptive attitudes that reflect patchy local conditions of deprivation or injustice. But they also have other imaginative, deliberative, and contextual resources for imperfectly but somewhat reliably recognizing and responding to the good. Moreover, the social world incentivizes some kinds of wrongdoings and some kinds of right doing. And these incentives intersect in complex ways with Shosho's social position, their experiences, and the ability to imagine different courses of action in life projects. In one context, Shosho might be adept at meeting reasonable expectations and normative demands, and in other contexts, not. Okay, so that's the Shosho case. So here, I think, we have this is, I take it, a case fairly close to the world that we live in. And one way of thinking about this is that partly, again, what looks like it's doing the work on the culpability side is about the extent to which those normative capacities are intact or not. Okay, so some reflections about the case. One is just the fact of patchiness. So Shosho might have adaptive attitudes about gender, for example, but not about class. Let's see, Shosho might be great at recognizing institutional oppression, for example. So third-party institutional oppression, Shosho could be great at recognizing, except, and then insert, here's where the adaptiveness did its work. Very clannish, like if it interacts with family or Shosho's own interest, then Shosho just doesn't get it. It's like, faculty at universities where the graduate students are unionizing. Okay, so you have these moments of, that's totally not fair. Apologies to all of my activist colleagues. So also you might think adaptive attitudes doesn't entail no capacity to track the true and the good. That is, it may block some, making others harder, maybe requires managing or circumventing, right? So that's part of that patchiness that we saw where the, Shosho's inclinations to not be great about, or to be great about gender, but not about class, might mean that there are going to be cases where these things interact in complicated ways, where in these contexts, it doesn't matter. Shosho's really great at tracking those things. And in those contexts, it turns out Shosho's terrible at tracking the kinds of morally, normatively relevant kinds of considerations because of the patchiness of how the attitudes operate. And so what you may also end up with are what we could think of as diachronic virtues. That is the ability to reflect on one's attitudes over time. So you might have incentives to subject one's own attitudes to scrutiny over time. Right. So here, kind of classic case about this is people absorb all sorts of reprehensible attitudes from their milieus where they grew up. They go off to college. They start getting forced to subject these attitudes to scrutiny over time. Some people might have the inclination to go ahead and go down those paths and reflect on those things. Other people might be super resistant to it. And it might turn out that responsiveness to the demands for scrutiny itself might turn out to be subject to all of the same kinds of adaptive effects that we've been talking about. But however that goes, I think it's going to plausibly turn on what I'm going to call the ecology of agency. That is, Shosho, it's not as though Shosho's like operating in a vacuum where the environment or the context, the social world in which Shosho's operating, it's not just that it loads her up and then sort of loads them up and then Shosho just keeps on trucking in the world. Rather, there's a constant set of interactions between opportunities and dispositions and the ongoing shaping of those things. So here's some things to think about that are gonna matter. So things like stability, how consistent is the environment for value chasing? What sorts of incentives are there to think, rethink, to canalize or calcify various kinds of dispositions and values? What sorts of institutional affordances there are, roles and powers? The situation for social scaffolding, what sorts of norms, enforcement, social learning, and valorization are going on. All of these things are things outside of the head that are going to end up mattering for the way in which Shosho-style cases are going to end up unfolding. And ecological conditions are going to be crucial for the facilitating and the formation of agency, including adaptive agency. So this is just kind of a general observation about these things. And here, this is just really just a footnote about that thought, is that you might think there are special cases, what I'm going to call a nefarious ecology that tends towards collapse of the ability to recognize and respond to the true and the good. So I take it that JoJo case is supposed to be one of those cases where it's not that that JoJo was born with a given normative defect. It was rather that the ecology was such that over time it trended towards the collapse of the ability to recognize and respond to the true and the good, such that even if you were to remove JoJo from those contexts, maybe JoJo's too far gone, or at any rate functionally too far gone, where it would be extraordinarily difficult to get JoJo to go back to tracking the true and the good, whatever these things turn out to be. Okay, this is for people who worry about the public ecology of discourse in the United States, for example. This is the kind of thing you want to avoid, right? You don't want to end up in a case where we are in a death spiral for the ability to talk about and to meaningfully talk about and latch on to value in whatever form it takes. All right. So here I want to say, finally, get to a few remarks about responsibility and then how all of this hooks together. So thanks for bearing with me here. So thinking about the culpability for adaptive agency and for exercises of adaptive agency. Here are, I think, our main options. So one is you could, of course, go some eliminativist or no moral responsibility view, right? So my friend and colleague, Dirk Pereboom, he's got a view like this, where the thought is nobody's really morally responsible, and partly it's because nothing can really be attributed and traced back to you in the relevant way. It's all really the universe just unfolding in the ways it does, and so there's nothing left over to be able to hook responsibility onto. And so you could have that kind of view, and you could just think like, no, this is what adaptive agency is just pointing out, is it's just a species of this more general basic problem that there's no buck stoppers running around in the universe. And so really we should just think there's no culpability there or anywhere else. It becomes especially vivid to us in the adaptive agency case. The problem with that sort of view, I think, not that this is a fatal problem, but I think it's a drawback or cost to the view, is that it doesn't explain what's distinctive about these cases. So that is, it feels like, look, there's something different going on in these cases that's different from a non-adaptive case. And so we need an explanation about what that is. And it's not obvious this gets us there. Now, one thing you could think is, well, maybe what's different is that the people with adaptive agency always enjoy exculpation. They're not responsible for what they do. And notice this is compatible with a range of other kinds of responses. So you could say, look, every time somebody acts from adaptive agency, they're not responsible for what they do, but it doesn't mean we don't have any tools by way of which we can respond to them. We just can't respond to them in the fault-finding ways. So, Cheshire Calhoun has this really interesting paper back in '89 about responding to wrongdoing with reproach, where the idea of the reproach is in some sense, you don't think that the person at fault or, nominally at fault is really at fault, but it's your effort to begin to kind of, as it were, move the norms by engaging in reproach. There's the kind of a couple of Parabumian recommendations at different stages. So early on, his thought was, well, maybe we can respond to more wrongdoing with a kind of moral sadness. So, this is the, look, I'm really disappointed at the thing you did. It's not a fault-finding one, but a disappointment reaction. Or the axiological recommendation reaction, where the thought is, look, it would have been better if you had not done that thing. Again, not necessarily fault-finding. But again, in all of these cases, if you want to go that route, you still owe an explanation about why culpability is blocked in the adaptive agency cases. And now maybe you can give it, maybe somebody can go that route, but I think it's a challenge for just wanting to walk away from these cases saying, well, of course, nobody's really responsible in these cases. And then we would need to know exactly how and why. And one of the, well, I'll talk more about that in just a moment. And then, of course, there's the variation problem. So one thing, and I think this is one of the things that emerges from thinking about the differences between JoJo, Bobo, and Shosho, is that you end up with the variation problem again. Some cases look like they make culpability, whether you want to do it via control or do you want to do it through identification, maybe it makes it look more difficult, but maybe not impossible. And then other cases, it looks like what it does something impossible. So I take it something like this is supposed to be the difference between the JoJo case and the Bobo case. That is, the JoJo case, it looks like it's cut off a certain set of normative capacities, whereas in the Bobo case, it looks like, yeah, you have the same kind of totalizing dominating structure intact, but it's not destroying the normative capacities, and this seems to affect our inclination about how to respond to the cases. So it's not obvious that everybody's just exonerated from any amount of adaptive agency is going to be the right answer. So I think we need to have an account of adaptive agency that allows for its varied status as culpable or not, and then we need an explanation for why. Okay, so here's a kind of this is the part of the talk where I do the table pounding, and I just tell you what I think has got to be the true view, and then all my friends who are in the room who think that this is the wrong view will just be shaking their heads. Like Dave is getting ready to Dave Shoemaker is ready to start throwing things at the screen here, but this is what's this is the part where I tell you what I really think. So one option are these kind of broadly real self, sometimes called identificationist or self-expression views. So your options for a theory of culpability or theory of moral responsibility, some of the kind of big families of views. One of them is this real self view. But tellingly, these are the views that think, look, you're culpable when the action expresses or your real self, your deep self, or it stands in the right kind of relationship to authoritative, deep and central values that organize your agency. But of course, famously, the whole point of the JoJo case was that it was a counterexample to these theories. That is, it presented a challenge to these theories. And one way of thinking about it is that this got kind of worked through pretty heavily in the feminist autonomy literature, was the problem of trying to anchor in any story grounded in values that looks like it doesn't quite capture all the things we're worried about in these deep self kinds of cases. But additionally, these real self views face challenges from slips and acratic action, really any case that doesn't reflect your values, but we tend to regard as being culpable. And there are lots of these kinds of cases running around. It's not obvious how these real self views handle this. Now, of course, as with any distinguished position in any area of philosophy, the proponents of these views are going to have things they want to say about these kinds of cases. But I think there's sort of fairly widespread recognition that these are the kind of challenging cases that are costly for the for the real self views to articulate a satisfying defense to. In contrast, the view that has no difficulties whatsoever and is obviously true is the family of reasons or control views that emphasize the possession of rational capacities being the ground or foundation for culpability. And so these things usually require at least minimally two sets of important capacities. So one is what sometimes get called recognitional or normative powers, normative control, and then volitional control. So the idea is you have to be able to recognize and you have to be able to suitably respond to reasons or considerations or normatively relevant reasons. So that's the basic structure of these views. And the idea is when you have that thing, then that's when you're culpable for what you do. Insert lots of bells and whistles. Like I said, these are really, it's like Donald Trump calls his telephone calls. It's a perfect call. And I think the part that the variety of the species of these kinds of views to which people who work in San Diego seem to be attracted to is a broadly ecological version of it, where the idea is, look, you've got to have that kind of normative control and volitional control, or the recognitional and responsiveness things, but then you also need this other third thing, which is adequate opportunities or a set of ecological conditions where these are features outside of an agent. And so you need all three of these things to be set up in the right way. So the way my colleague David Brink thinks about these things is in terms of fair opportunities. My colleague Dana Nelkin thinks about these things in terms of the quality of opportunities. And I think of these things in roughly the terms of having circumstantially relevant control. And so there are different kinds of regimentations for this basic idea, but there's a kind of a family of views here that want to leverage these sorts of things. So I'm going to help myself to the second set of views. And then I think these things give us some bells and whistles for being able to explain what's going on in some of these adaptive agency cases. A couple of quick epicycles here worth flagging. I don't know, not epicycles, deployments really, I think, the theory. So think about color blindness. So color blindness constrains some ways of acting in the world, and how much depends on how the world is built. So take the kind of case of take a kind of case of somebody who is, has to be able to reliably and safely drive. If you live in a world in which you've got standardized traffic lights where the colors are in a specific order, then it doesn't matter that you're colorblind. But in a world where the idea is, look, red means stop and green means go, but we're not consistent about how we order those colors, then of course colorblindness is going to constrain which way you operate in the world. So part of what these ecological theories think is like, look, our ability to reliably interact with the world partly depends on the world being set up in ways that facilitate our being able to do that. Or take another case, here's another sort of example about the deployment of these broadly ecological strategies. Take the baby monitoring kind of case. So you're caretaker of a baby, you've got a robust commitment to this child. Let's suppose it's yours or you're related to you in some way, shape, or form, and not one you're trying to get rid of. But of course, the challenge with young kids is that they have intermittent demands. It's not like they're always awake, always making demands, but rather they're intermittently needing demands. And a lot of folks have robust distractions. So you've got a case where you're trying to pay attention to the baby monitor, but then department fight is breaking out that's getting litigated over email and the department listserv, or your neighbors are fighting or whatever, and now your attention is shifted off and it's harder to pay attention to the baby monitor and to know what's going on because distraction is doing its work. So do you have control? Well, you have the responsibility relevant control to reliably pay attention to it. The extent to which it's taxed is partly a function about the ecology that you're in, or the circumstances or context you're in. And if things got bad enough and the distractions were robust enough, it begins to look like you have a basis for some exculpation. Again, all of these things admit of scalarity. And so if you really like, formulas make you feel more comfortable, then we can deploy my colleague David Brink's formula here for thinking about this. blameworthiness being proportional to desert, which is itself a function of wrongdoing and responsibility in so doing. So there you go. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about adaptive rational agency, and then I'll call it a day here. So here's how to think about these adaptive agency cases with that kind of ecological reasons responsiveness framework in hand. So the issue is we don't want to deny the normatively significant agency. We're trying to avoid that horn of the dilemma. But it would also be weird if adaptive agency isn't ever relevant for culpability, blameworthiness, and responsibility. And the answer here is to just think, well, look, adaptiveness affects blameworthiness, sometimes via internal features, like that is, it impairs the internal control features, either recognitional or volitional abilities. And sometimes some of that makes people susceptible or more susceptible to the role of these ecological or structural effects. So that was part of what the thought was supposed to be about the way in which the ecology gets going. So recall, of course, that the social world provides hooks to shape agency in injustice conducive ways. That's part of what, part of the way it works. So, if we think, suppose we're egalitarians, and then the old Cohen line about if you're an egalitarian, how come you're so rich? Many of us are prepared to answer that question about why we're so rich. It's because, until the revolution comes, we might as well enjoy the fruits of our labors or whatever. Or there's no way to alter the structural world. So we have these articulations that we use, it's like, well, I deserve this because I worked hard. And so we begin to tell these stories for ourselves, and they social narratives around them and so on. And then it begins to do its work, right? So then nobody looks askance at the person who, in our putatively egalitarian society, is doing better than the neighbor. And you have to get up into Elon Musk territory before people start to raise an eyebrow, and then they're still defenders of the inegalitarianism. So, I mean, that's to pick a loaded example, but there are, of course, lots of different ways you might tell this story about the social world, both shaping the agency in ways that hide these things and help justify people's understanding of them and the shaping their dispositions. And of course, we have self-deception about complicity with this, in as much as we're subject to these adaptive sorts of things. So, third personally, so-and-so dresses that way because of patriarchy. First personally, I feel good dressing this way. Right, that sort of thing happens, and just lots and lots of variations about how that unfolds. Last, of course, you can't read adaptiveness off of the actual choices. Revealed preferences are often conditional preferences that are rational responses to incentives. There's a quick footnote about this. So I think this is one of the things that's been really interesting in the adaptive preferences literature, that the kind of contemporary wave of work on this, Serene Cotter's work here is particularly helpful in this way, has pointed to a lot of things that look like putative cases of adaptive preferences turn out to be instead cases where people have what looks like robustly rational responses to what their local incentives are, such that if you were to change what the incentives were to change the goodies, that it turns out that the supposed preference goes away, which makes it look like it's not really a deep preference in the way in which a lot of the adaptive preference people have tended to worry about. So a lot of these kinds of cases look like the supposed cases that were animating the worries about adaptive preferences in some of the older literature. A lot of these cases look like they don't stand up well to scrutiny. That's of course possible. It's compatible with there still being adaptive preferences in various ways, but it looks like you can't read adaptiveness necessarily off choices, and you can't necessarily read the kind of irrationality of these things off of the choice patterns. So here's the take home then. Some, but not all, adaptive preferences function in a way that screens off epistemic access to morally appropriate attitudes. If the adaptive agent lacks sufficient imaginative, experiential, or motivating resources for recognizing and repairing those attitudes or capacities, then he or she will have diminished responsibility. Where that responsibility is diminished enough, you get mitigated or even no culpability. But again, this is the part where ecologies matter. So if you've got the right kind of context that encourages reflection on your attitudes, where they come from, what their basis is, whether there are alternatives, and so on, then those things might provide opportunities to have an adequate basis where, supposing you're retaining your, kind of rational normative capacities, the adaptive agent might come to have culpability for failing to capitalize on the opportunities to, as it were, reshape his or her psychology in ways that do a better job of tracking the good. Okay, in sum, I think the more general phenomenon is adaptive agency, not specifically adaptive preferences or even adaptive attitudes. The so what in adaptive agency cases, your agency is fitted to circumstances of injustice, making the injustice less apparent, less easy to contest. These may be pretty pervasive. Modernity, capitalism, ideology, whatever the thing is that you like to worry about, those things can be all over the place. Still, adaptive attitudes are compatible with culpability, at least if you've got a certain kind of view, and that gives you one reason to favor these broadly ecological accounts, as they seem to have the resources to explain what's going on in a helpful way. So I think that's it for me.
Thank you, Manuel. That was great. Unshare your screen for me for a second.
All right.
Dave was like quick to the punch. He's just waiting there to hit you with that slap hand for the last 10 or 15 minutes, I think.
Yeah.
I'll let Dave ask the first question, then Walter, and then I've got a question. We'll see how that goes. John will have the question before me. Go ahead, Dave.
Thanks, Manuel. I see Manuel. Hold on a second.
You retract your objection.
There we go. Yes. No, of course not. So I hate the type of person who's about to be me in asking this kind of question, but it has to do with, previous work. But you're assuming a kind of monism here in determining the nature of culpability and the kind of responsibility that's going to deliver the goods on culpability. But it seems like these kinds of cases are perfect examples to treat in terms of a kind of pluralistic approach, so that it might be that the relevant kinds of agency or adaptive preferences imply certain things about character or maybe answerability, which is what I would think is going to be most affected here. But they may not have certain kinds of effects on empathic capacities, which we might think are important for accountability. And so there might be some mitigating effects on character, serious mitigating effects on answerability, and maybe no mitigating effects at all on accountability. In which case you've got a kind of ambivalence here, which is, I think, the right deliverance, which is a responsibility in certain respects, and responsibility, a lack of non-responsibility on other kinds of dimensions. So I'm wondering, why the commitment to the monism here when it looks like the pluralism can deliver the goods?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the reason why I go for the monism is because I like true theories over false theories. So okay, that's totally not fair. Like so I actually think so I want to be careful here, because I actually want to be ecumenical. That is, I don't see any reason why anything I said here needs to rule out the possibility of sort of pluralistic approaches to the evaluation of agency. Now, my focus was specifically on culpability, and I think some of these other notions, answerability and attributability, to my ear aren't culpability notions. They're agential evaluation notions, but it doesn't follow that they're culpability notions. Of course, people have disagreements about how to carve up the conceptual space here, but I think so. This was intended to be an account that was mostly focused, or that was focused on culpability, but that from the outset was designed to be, I think, potentially conciliatory anyway, to other kinds of concerns, where the thought is, yeah, and there might be other sorts of things that are going to interact in other ways. We might have other ways of evaluating agency, and that might include these questions about answerability and so on. So this isn't intended to be a comprehensive story about all the ways that adaptive agency ends up being normatively significant, or all the ways in which adaptive agency touches on things that people have called responsibility concerns. It was just the narrow question about what should we say about culpability. And so I think, I think, at least in principle, the view on offer here should be compatible with the pluralism.
You want to follow up with that? Oh, no. Okay. Walter, yes.
Hi, so very interesting, Manuel. I just want to get clear because I was confused at one point by what you meant by adaptive preferences. I'm really just trying to get clear about it. But when you issued the caution towards the end, you almost made it sound like they have to be rational. I'm sorry, they have to be irrational because you said, well, these rational reactions to the circumstances aren't adaptive preferences, but they are attitudes or preferences whose content is a product of oppression, domination, or deprivation. So I'm imagining somebody who's living a very poor and deprived life, but who prefers to rob the local convenience store instead of taking a job because they don't have a chance to get a decent job. So their preference is a product of the circumstances, and it's a product of, maybe even their capability of robbing the convenience store is a product of their circumstances. And it feeds the oppression of the group because robbing the local store means that your community is going to have less access to food, and the insurance is going to go up for the shop owner, and it's going to hurt all kinds of people who are already poor. Yeah. So it sounded like that was an adaptive preference from everything you said, until you said, oh, but if it's just a rational reaction to the circumstance, it's not an adaptive preference. So I guess my question is it or isn't it?
Yeah, good. So I may have misspoken on that slide. So the thought I was trying to get at, this is one of these places where the slippage in the terminology from as it were, the kind of first stage and second stage versions of these kinds of things has meant that at various points in time, the literature has been talking at cross purposes with itself. About what the stakes are. So in that early literature, one of the big fights was about whether or not whether these preference changes in the sour grapes kinds of cases were irrational preference changes. And so some people thought it was baked into the very idea of an adaptive preference, that it be irrational. And then part of what folks in this sort of second wave adaptive preferences literature, what they were noting is that in a lot of these cases, it doesn't look like it's irrational. It looks like it's a fully rational sort of thing. And so if what you wanted out of adaptive preferences was to show irrationality, then it wasn't going to do that. But then on this second wave characterization, where the thought is, no, what it is it's attitudes that are sourced in and expressive of, or expressive of support of the injustice, then then it might be rational or it might be irrational, but that's just in some sense orthogonal to the question about whether or not it's an adaptive preference, because the adaptive preference profile is just given by source plus it's being expressive of or supportive of injustice.
So, and is it also orthogonal to culpability?
Irrationality or adaptiveness?
Is the person that I described who's robbing the store instead of getting a job because of the oppressive circumstances, is the fact that they're rationally reacting to their situation mean that they're more culpable than somebody who was not as rash, whose adaptive preferences were not rational?
Yeah, good. So we'd have to work through the details of the case, but the short version is it partly depends on what whether or not there were reasonable opportunities available. So assume reasonable opportunities available, and so I think the kind of the standard view here is that if there were reasonable opportunities available, even if so long as you're rational and you've got reasonable opportunities available, then you're culpable. And that doesn't go away just because the attitudes or even the capacities are adaptive. And so that's supposed to be the way that the picture works. And then there might be cases under which part of the social context is that the opportunities, there is not a morally adequate opportunity available, or a fair opportunity or a suitable quality of opportunity. And then when that happens, then that's the source of the exculpation.
Thanks.
John.
I think actually that's Laura. You're like misnaming the question.
I stole her tile. Hey, can you go back to the slide where you refuted the real self views? Because
Oh, let's see here. Oh, you're going to defend the real self views? I thought you didn't think those things existed
You made me
anymore.
think that I've had the JoJo case exactly wrong, and since my prior probabilities on that are low, I thought we should sort it out.
Okay. So what, you want the JoJo one or the argument against the real self?
Well, what the place where you said the real self views were refuted by JoJo style cases. And I thought if they were refuted for a different reason. It was toward the end of the talk.
Okay, yeah, so I think I got it here. Let's see. So here we go. Is that it?
Yeah. So I thought what was weird about JoJo and depraved upbringing cases, which then also might be adaptive preference cases, is very plausible that it expresses his values, but there seems to be something unfair or culpability undermining about how he got the values. So I would have thought this was a case where at least the most plausible version of the real self type views, the worry was not that it's too lenient, but that it's too too bloody minded. And I think there's a fix just in terms of whether the upbringing in fact caused cognitive impairments of the sort that prevent the appropriate formation of values. But leaving that aside, isn't that the problem with the case like JoJo's? Sure looks like those are his values. But
yeah, so
I culpable.
I mean, so as I read the Wolf, I mean, so there's, I mean, I think there's maybe two different questions here. There's the Wolf exegesis, and then there's the, you know, how to stack up where the problem question is. But
yeah. Never mind the Wolf exegesis.
Okay, so but part of the reason why I like the Wolf example, the JoJo example, is because because I think, you know, one way to think about it is, well, look, what's doing the work? Is it the acquisition, or is it the ensuing functionality? And I think that one of the things that I mean, and this is what the way I was inclined to have interpreted the Wolf, but the take two different cases. Take JoJo 1 and JoJo 2. So JoJo 1, you have a depraved upbringing, and then you have then you have no functioning, no ability to track the true and the good, and then but in both of these cases it's going to be identification. Right, so we have identification, bad upbringing, and then no ability to track the good. And then think about what I was calling the Bobo case, right, where you have, or it's like the Bobo case, which I guess technically another case, but like JoJo, the second JoJo case, where you have identification, depraved upbringing, but normative capacities are intact. And then I think in the normative capacities that are intact, that satisfies the thing that Wolf was pushing, that is the connection to the true and the good. And so it looks like part of what this case is supposed to illustrate is that it's not the depraved upbringing that is the explanatory force of it. That's just that's a causal story. It's not like where the defect comes from, but where the source of the problem is for the identification theories is it looks like, and this is why they had to be supplemented, she seemed to think, was that that identification alone doesn't do the work. And what we need is the ability to track the true and the good, or to track what reasons there are.
Here's another way to put maybe what I'm tripping on. The Acratic case looks exactly like what you have after the IE, the problem where the identificationist views are too lenient. I certainly didn't identify with my compulsively gobbling the smokehouse almonds.
Yeah.
Right. But it's plausible that I'm culpable for being intemperate or something. And that just looks like a very different case than the way to spin JoJo, where I thought on Wolf's view and on the natural ways the story gets told, he's unconflicted and then slips or something else again. But so maybe that what seems to me weird is this, what seems to be implied is assimilating the JoJo case to an Acratic case.
So I think we are in vigorous agreement at this point. So I mean, so I take the thought to, so you know.
Oh, so those are different problems.
Yeah, so
Yeah, okay,
this is
okay.
real self-use problems include JoJo case, semicolon.
Okay.
Also maybe
But-
slips and acratic action. And so I
Okay,
agree that
and
these
you
are
say,
each have-
i.e. any case that doesn't reflect values but seems culpable, and that fits acratic actions very well. And I thought JoJo cases much less well.
Yeah, so I wasn't, I was thinking of the IE as being contained
Okay.
within after the semicolon, but
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but I think these are just, I agree that
so
these are distinct.
that's not
problems.
meant to be a gloss on JoJo.
That's right, yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
so that was unclear, yeah.
Good.
All right.
You can unshare if you want real quick, Manuel.
No, now I'm trying to protect myself against other objections. Okay, so let's see here if I can do this without turning everything off.
There we go.
All right.
So I'm going to look at, just really quick, ask a question that's focused on adaptive beliefs rather than preferences, under the assumption that the preferences will often be shaped by the beliefs.
Yeah, good.
I'm also going to help myself to the assumption that something like system justification is a real psychological phenomenon, right? So that's the background. And so I believe that to be true. And I know that the literature on system justification influences how people view inequality in society, for instance. And you could be low or high in system justification. We can measure that with measures that, the scales that measure these sorts of things. So I know all that is real. I'm just assuming that's real. It might tell me how high or low I am in system justification, but as a result of having the beliefs I happen to have, which I've internalized, having been raised a particular way, right, in a society that is radically unjust, I don't know what impact the system justifying trends of society have influenced my own evaluations, beliefs, and preferences with respect to how I should behave and navigate an unjust society. And I don't know how I would even go about disentangling that, right? So I can think about all I want, because what I know is if you have resources, for instance, if you're on the right side of the inequality divide, then you're going to overestimate how much you deserve it or how much you've earned it or how talented you are or everything else. And if you're on the wrong side of that, then you're going to underestimate how much you are entitled to. You're going to overestimate how hard the other side works and all that. I know where I fit in some sense in the divide, but I have no way of figuring out at what point I'm sort of get this ecologically, the R&R plus ecological criteria are satisfied. So I can't even so, and I am rational. I know the literature. So imagine if I've never even heard of system justification, or imagine if fill in the blank, right? So what would the conditions be where it would make sense to say, I mean, if even I can't parse how to figure, I can't disentangle myself from the likelihood of my own adaptive beliefs and preferences, many of which are going to be behind the veil no matter what I do. So how do we, if that's in the background, how would we track any of the things? Dave, you're right. I don't pick whichever one of those things. I prefer to treat them individually, the things, right? Instead of being a monist, the pluralistic. But even if I look at it the pluralistic way, how do I figure that out? Because I know you don't want the skepticism, right? I'm plumbing for the skepticism over here, but in any event. Yeah. So what do you think?
Yeah, good. I think this is a great question. So I think as a first pass, let's pull apart two different versions of the question. So one is, can we give a satisfying bit of metaphysical bookkeeping about what's going on and what are the properties that matter, or would, as it were, provide truth conditions for these kinds of things? And one answer is, of course, people can just say, I don't care about that. But I take it that this bit of theorizing is in that spirit of trying to describe what the kinds of truth conditions are on whether or not people are culpable or not. And then there, I think, is the kind of, as it were, the practical version, which is going to then be heavily entangled in these epistemic questions that you're pressing about what should I, qua self-aware, reasonably informed, and now worried about culpability, adaptive agency, and so on. What should I do, or what should I think? And you might think, and we're, we, the audience for a talk like this, maybe we're, in a better position than a lot of folks are with respect to having some sense about what the risks are and so on. And so I think that's a great question for which I don't take myself to have said anything in the talk that is that provides guidance on how to think about that. But what I am inclined to say is, well, look, it's a little bit like the old Aristotle recommendation about like how to do virtue. If you're pulling right when you're shooting the bow and you're trying to hit the middle of the target, then you're going to have to pull left some. Now, how much we might not ever really know, but I think it's so I think that's this totally unhelpful advice, that if we know that we're going to be inclined to a certain amount of inclination to be self-deceived in ways that are self-serving, and then we should discount to some amount our convictions that look like they're entwined in those ways. But it's not going to be neat, it's not going to be clean, and it's going to be super messy. And I think this is I think it's a real and genuinely interesting challenge for, once we acknowledge the possibility of adaptive agency, we think it's all over the place and it's going to be cultivated and served up by this huge range of social pressures to hide the fact of injustice from us, that the search for it is not going to be straightforward. And maybe we just don't have really great tools for finding it, except in our stumbling, uncertain ways that we tend to go about doing these things over time.
Yeah, so just real quick follow-up. That sounds right. I mean, that part sounds right. I guess I wasn't trying to lean so heavily on like the what about me, what am I supposed to do part, although that's how I presented it. It was more like, now if I look at others and I want to judge others, I want to make culpability assessments of other people. If I have a hard time navigating this for myself.
Oh,
right?
good. Yeah.
And like,
okay.
So it's not just about what do I do? It's like, how do I make the culpability assessments? I don't even know how to make them work for myself. So how am I supposed to possibly make them work for other people when I'm not in their heads? I don't understand, so on and so forth. But they are, I appreciate they are separate, but related questions, but yeah.
Yeah, good. So this is great. I mean, I think there are a couple of different things we can say about this. I mean, so one is that notice that on these accounts, I haven't said anything about where the thresholds are. That is how how sensitive do you need to be to to relevant considerations in order to have the right kind of cognition and the right kind of volitional control, or the right kind of circumstantial control. And one thing you could think is, well, depending on where you come out on those issues, you could think that where those things are more readily gotten, then it increases the likelihood that people are culpable, and where those things are harder, like where the standards are higher in order to count, then our baseline should be, well, actually, we're going to probably overascribe responsibility significantly, need to lay off of that. Now, here, I mean, this is not something I've been trying to push in this talk. So I wanted this talk to be relatively modular in a certain kind of sense. But I do think that there are, now here's the rest of Manuel's convictions, I guess, doing some work by way of answer the question. I do think, look, if you think of responsibility along the lines that I'm inclined to think of it, as a kind of social regulation system that back-end support for cooperation and coordination, and for the cultivation of normative consideration sensitive agency, that if you think that's what responsibility practices are really about, that's what they're doing for us, then the place for where the standards have to be set in order for people to be culpable and then to get the benefits of having a system like that. No, so this is all that instrumental justification stuff. It's going to have to turn out not that everybody's always exculpated, but rather that the default is mature agents who are reasonably competent at norm navigation and so on. That they're going to be on the hook, and it's going to be imperfect, and it's going to miss some things here or there. But that's some reason for thinking that that an effective responsibility system is going to have it's going to be like a it's going to have low standards.
Yeah. The low standards is hilarious. That should be the title of a paper.
Yeah. Or any talk I'm giving, probably.
Oh, anyway, Lauren, yes.
Hi, thanks, Manuel, for a great talk, and thanks to Thomas, and yeah, especially Thomas, but everybody else for organizing. I think this is a follow-up on a couple of questions, and I wasn't quite sure how to ask it, but I saw nobody else's hand was up, so I'm just going to give you the case that motivated the question and then give you an indication of the two different ways I thought about phrasing it more elegantly. So I recently learned that Tile Mason, I've known for many, many years, is a leader of QAnon in St. Louis, where I live. And, you know, somebody I know well, I've counted him as a friend. And so we talked about it a little bit. And when he was trying to explain to me, he knows that, you know, I'm a philosopher and, you know, think it's ridiculous, have discussed conspiracy theories in my epistemology class. He tried to explain to me that the reason that I and others like me were not persuaded by Q is a result of cognitive dissonance. So it's too painful for me to revise my existing beliefs in order to accommodate the truth that he's sort of advocating in the community. I'm wondering, I say it's partly a follow-up because I started thinking about this case and when Walter noted the possibility that like responsibility might be inverted for people that are like historically marginalized and less able to exercise agency, so choose rationally to rob convenience stores and things like that. And it seems to me that the same kind of worry arises in a case like this. The first way I was going to ask it was about how you think your view can sort of be extended to account for epistemic agency, in addition to sort of like the classical action theoretic notions. And the other one was just the scope. So how outside of sort of the standards of rationality or normalcy characteristic of like cult beliefs and stuff do you have to get in order that it applies? Yeah, it's not really a question, I apologize, but
no, this is, I think this is really, yeah, you can turn any, you know, as Al Mealy taught me, you can turn anything into a question by just throwing a, what do you think about that at the end of the question. So this is already a question. So good. I mean, I think part of the answer to these things, it was the tail end of my answer to Thomas, was you know, it depends on how you think, what you think a responsibility system is supposed to be doing. And so I have a kind of instrumentalist, functionalist kind of story I like to tell about these kinds of things. But you know, lots of other theorists of responsibility think that's crazy. And so, but if you have the kind of story I have, then I guess I'm inclined to think, well, we want to have the standards be relatively low standards. That is, it's relatively easy to satisfy the standards for culpability, but we don't want them to be too low, right? So because otherwise you get, people defecting from recognizing the authority of the norms and so on. So we need to have a certain amount of buy-in on these kinds of things. And then there are these kinds of questions about like, trade-offs between more and less expansive about who we let in or don't let in into the kind of the community of fully culpable agents. But I guess I think, it's not that we couldn't end up with folks who are, as it were, on. So Ken Taylor had this piece years ago, whose title is now going to elude me. It was actually one of the last things he wrote before he passed away. But it was this idea that one of the things that can happen is, it might well turn out that people end up on, as it were, epistemic islands, where, it just turns out that because he has this kind of non-convergent rationality picture where he just doesn't think that rationality is going to converge for all of us, and that we can end up with people who are off on epistemic islands where they might have gotten there through tracking out, by reasoning reasonably, but then ending up in places where, they're relatively alone or isolated from the rest of us. And I think in those kinds of cases, I guess I'm inclined to say as a first pass that and here I maybe I would take advantage of a certain amount of kind of the possibility of some relativistic thinking about responsibility, which I think doesn't entail relativistic thinking about all of morality, but you might think norms of culpability and blameworthiness might have this feature, even if you were a full-blown realist about the rest of morality. where we could end up thinking something like, wow, that we, that if you've got two different islands and they're staring at each other, it might be that we don't have cross-island culpability. But what we could have is culpability internal to islands, and that part of the way these processes unfold over time is we're trying to build out and extend our, the folks on our island, or to build our island out. And so we'd have to talk through the details of the case and so on. And I mean, there are these interesting questions about, it's always easy to say somebody else is got cognitive dissonance and it's too hard for them to take on board X, Y, and Z and so on. And I know there are folks who've done some much more careful work than I have about like how to think about the epistemology of conspiracy theories and about the limits of these kinds of cases. So so I think I'd be inclined to ask Caitlin O'Connor or whatever what should I think about these kinds of cases. So that's the more general version of the issue. The narrower question about, I don't know if it's narrow. Anyway, the other question about the epistemology bit. So I guess in some moods, when I first started thinking about these things, I was thinking about them only about culpable agency qua, like moral blameworthiness or the kind of moral quality of actions, and not thinking about them at all in terms of the epistemic side of the story. These days, I'm certainly open to, it might turn out that the basic structures I was talking about the capacities to recognize and respond to reasons and pressures for recognizing and tracking normative reasons. The most expansive version of normative reasons is, of course, going to include epistemic reasons in it. And at that point, then it looks like the basic structure of the account might generalize, where we can just talk about people being culpably bad reasoners and culpably bad sort of lay epistemologists or whatever, and whether or not people can be credited or blamed for their beliefs might be a function of, and then insert analogous structures on how all that goes. So in some moods, I'm pretty sympathetic to the possibility of a generalization of the general shape of the view I was suggesting.
Great. Well, thank you. So Manuel, thank you very much. Well, thank you for your talk. Everyone can thank Manuel. Somehow we only ended up less than 10 minutes behind schedule, which was a miracle. Let's see if tomorrow can be equally as miraculous. I doubt it. I'm gonna unshare. I'm gonna unpin you. I'm gonna pin myself. Actually, I'm not gonna pin myself. I'm just gonna share my screen very quickly, just to remind everybody about tomorrow. So tomorrow morning, tomorrow afternoon at noon, we'll get started. Just like today, for people who weren't here tonight, John will give a very brief introduction to Moral Psychology Research Group. I'll once again give an introduction to the format that we're going to use. There'll be a data blitz. Originally, this was supposed to be 10 participants. Now we've got 11. That's fine. These are 5-minute presentations. There'll be no Q&A. This is the part that I'm most nervous about pulling off, because this is kind of an organizational nightmare for me to cycle through all these people in 5-minute clips, but that's what we're going to try to do. So that starts at noon. We'll take a quick break, and then Jessica Somerville will give a talk at roughly 1:15 or so. Florian Kova, his talk will be here again roughly at 2. And then the keynote address tomorrow by Tanya Lombroso will be whatever, I guess around 3 o'clock will be my guess. So hopefully you can join us tomorrow. Thanks for attending this afternoon. If you want more information about the group, you can find it at the URL on the screen. And hopefully I will see you all tomorrow. I'll stick around for a second if people have questions or anything they want to talk about. So thanks again for showing up.
Thank you, Thomas.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Hey, Manuel, we should talk to Sam. I like working with him on these experimental projects because he and I disagree about a lot of stuff, so it makes for good collaboration. We should revisit the system justification stuff and some of the stuff on adaptive preferences. I'd be curious. It doesn't answer anything you're talking about, but it would be interesting to figure out how people think about those very issues. It's something we navigate, right? So it might be a worthwhile thing. I probably have enough research funding squirreled away that we could run, a series of studies. He and I have been trying to figure out what we wanted to do. And then what your talk sort of piqued my curiosity and that sort of stuff. So maybe we can we can talk after tomorrow if you're going to be there. If not, we can I'll shoot you an email. We can maybe meet with Sam. We can talk about whether there might be something worth doing.
Awesome. All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you again for donating your Friday afternoon.
All right. My pleasure. Thanks so much, everybody.
Have a good one.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Nicole. See you, Lauren.
Hey, Thomas, great job.
I guess.
Great job,
Beautiful.
yeah. So